morning, everyone, and welcome to the regular meeting of the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners. Audience members, I want to start by asking you to please silence your electronic devices. I would also like to remind you that in addition to the audience in this room, we have people watching and listening online, so please consider your language in comments and testimony today. Today's meeting is a hybrid board meeting, so some presenters and guests will appear in person and some will appear virtually. For those presenting virtually, please mute your mic when not speaking, and when presenting, make sure to unmute your mic and turn on your camera. For those who are here in person to provide public testimony or present, please turn on your mic when you begin speaking so the green light is showing, and off when you've completed your remarks so the red light is showing. For all presenters, please state your name for the record before speaking or responding to questions. There are no items on the consent agenda today, so Marina, can we move on to public testimony?
Opportunity for public comment on non-agenda matters. This is the time for the board to hear public testimony, not for board deliberation. When it is your turn to speak, I'll call your name and unmute you or call you to the presenter's table. I'll set a timer for 3 minutes when you begin speaking and announce when your time is up, at which point please wrap up your sentence. Chair, we received 3 verbal testimonies and 1 written testimony, which was shared with board members and staff. I'll call 4 people at a time. Ann Casper, Charles Johnson, and Lightning.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name, oh, that's really loud. Good morning. My name is Ann Casper, and I co-create Mental Health Solutions. I've been part of the Leipzig Mental Health Safety Committee for about 20 years now, and I'm here to speak on the Juvenile Crime Prevention Plan that Leipzig will be talking about on next week. And I was looking at it, and also I have a relative who teaches at Donald E. Long for many, many years. I saw a lot of things missing, and I saw voices missing. So I hope in the future, when you make these plans, which you want to do the best, because I work in mental health, in the mental health civil rights movement. And what happens is it happens to the juveniles, and then, 50% of our criminal justice is people with mental health issues. So we want to start there at the juvenile and do well. I suggest in the future, if you can, have people with the National Alliance of Mental Illness Families there. Youth ERA, which is a national, it's actually started in Oregon, a national organization that works with youth mental health and also criminal justice. I would have them at the table. Martin Rafferty and Kelly Davis, who work nationally, who've been here in Oregon, and use these. I looked at the literature review. There wasn't a lot there. You can do more review on that. And also, I didn't see a lot of LGBTQ youth groups who came in to give testimony or input into the report as well. I'm just encouraging you to get the people with the lived experience of that at those tables. And as you know, Commissioner Edwards, remembers, when you get the youth there from the Portland Public Schools, it just turns out to be a better product. Also in mental health, I'm going to encourage you for the office, I believe it's called Engagement, that you have newsletters. It's been there for about 7 years. I did it for free for 6 years before they were, they were scared to have a person with mental health issues in mental health and addictions offices. So I got help that set that up, but we don't have any public output. The website is out of date, and we're missing the voices of the people with quote unquote severe mental illness. I don't know a better term for that. We have a lot of addictions voices in there. And I like to visualize Multnomah County success because I know we can do better. And I know you're trying, and I'd like to thank you all for your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we do have Denise Pena, who's the director of DCJ, if you want to talk with her about the juvenile report.
Right.
Good morning. I'm Bridge Crane Charles Simca Johnson. It is very nice that the weather is much better than the last time I saw the county chair and her staff, as they were sure they were only trying to impress me by telling me that they were going to all, on that day, it was 6 severe weather shelters, and then, holy moly, we opened more. So that was a nice response to see. I wish there was a little bit more data capture there so that we could talk more about what that translates into people who would like to have indoor shelter available to them 365 nights a year without feeling strangled or overregulated. So I hope that if we have to do it again this year, heaven forbid, that the lessons we take from that, not just the struggle to get volunteers, but it's like, oh, we say people are shelter averse. but they come, and it's not always just because of the weather. Obviously, there's still the barrier for some of having so many belongings that they feel like their property, be it with a shopping cart or tent's worth of belongings, is at risk out there in the snow. It's so odd to not have a consent agenda, but that is partially, I think, because awesome things like appointments are not being done on consent agenda today. So it'd be nice to see the budget advisory committees grow. I know we just talked about that like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's still hard to, we're thinking about the various stipend optioned, and apparently the policy now with budget advisory committees is just uniform clarity of no stipend. Hopefully that will never happen to the Behavioral Health Advisory Committee as we meet tomorrow or in the future. One thing that I don't know if it's where the direction instruction should come from, but having an agenda that fits on all one page is super eco-sensitive, but it would probably be better if in R2 especially, at least once, we expanded HSD, HSD being a fresh new acronym, which used to mean JOHS, so the Homeless Services Department and the Once Upon a Time Joint Office of Homeless Services. People trying to improve their level of engagement with the county government, when they look at that, they would have to click through, and I don't know how far we have to click through to find out what HSD means. I do like that it comes out to be Doc Ramblings. I guess we're going to meet an actual person named Doc Ramblings, who does research and evaluation in HSD. So I'm going to be back for some of these other items. Wish you luck engaging with, she must be traumatized, Ms. Bonamici at the high school tomorrow, I think, tomorrow evening, as we try and keep the federal government from doing serious harm as it goes totally bonkers under 2 nut jobs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Jared Essig.
Hi, good morning, commissioners, Chair Vega Peterson, and congratulations, Commissioners Dixon, Singleton, and Moyer on your recent election. I'm here to speak about how to make Multnomah County healthy again by ending the chronic mental illness epidemic. And I want to thank RFK Jr. for his advocacy, and congratulations on his your appointment at as Health and Human Services Secretary. And I would like to say for the record that I'm of the opinion that schizophrenia and autism have the same efficient cause. Schizophrenia being essentially adult onset autism, autism being childhood onset schizophrenia. I don't think either of them are caused by vaccines. But there is a chronic mental illness epidemic in the country, and the psychopharmaceutical industrial complex is not helping us to deal with it. In fact, I think they're making the problem worse. But first, we have to talk about the difference between emotional illness and intellectual illness, which are both collapsed unhelpfully into the category of mental illness. And then there's the question of moral illness as well. And I'll be talking about these all later in the coming year. I wanted to discuss this, but I've been distracted by confronting the epidemic of prejudiced ignorance and anti-Jewish bias that's broken out in our public school teachers unions and the graduate teaching fellows at PSU and so on. And this is one of the reasons why I'm schizophrenic, is because I dissent from this perverted ignorance that was taught to me in my school and college and so on. And so I'll meet with the Behavioral Health Advisory Committee eventually and tell them my opinion on this, schizophrenia, manic depression, and how we can treat these. But your resource center down there in southeast or southwest, right near the library, it's practically impossible to get into that place. I go there and I can't get in. I have to walk 10 blocks north and then to get a ticket and then walk 10 blocks south. It was really great when it first opened. I could just walk up there, get a shower, get my clothes cleaned. It was wonderful. Now I just can't get in. It seems like it just exists for the benefit of county employees.
30 seconds.
Use it. So I implore
Your
you,
microphone is off.
but I implore you to open the Behavioral Health Resource Center for the community again.
Thank you.
One last check for lightning. Okay. Chair, that is all the public testimony for
All right.
non-agenda.
Thank you, Marina. Can we move on to R1?
R1, appointments to community budget advisory committees.
So moved.
Commissioner Singleton moves, Commissioner Jones-Dixon seconds. Approval of R1. Welcome back, Amara.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Amada Bettis. I'm the Director of the Office of Community Involvement. Thank you for the opportunity to be in further discussion with you regarding CBAC participation, demographics, representation, and recruitment. These issues and others that we presented have been pressing issues for a while. One certainly I have inherited, and most recently were identified and named in the CBAC improvement process with support from the chair and under Stephen Herrera's leadership last September. Lots of improvements needed, some code change, and I think the most recent changes adopted last week reflect a very critical start, but code changes must be met with programmatic, procedural, and practice-oriented changes. And this is the exact phase that we are in now within a larger process, a phase of implementing and evaluating and refining these strategies for improvement. The CBAC improvement will be the focus of this year's Central CBAC. OCI has already formed a work group with CBAC coordinators to develop a policy and procedure guidebook. OCI is being trained in Better Impact volunteer management system to collect and centralize participant data. We are revamping the application and onboarding process. And to better ensure equal and equitable representation, we are recruiting recruiters in your district offices, in departments, and with partnering community-based organizations. We're planning to work with departments to assess current teams and to set goals and develop outreach and recruitment plans based on those assessments and determine goals. And we are designing a mechanism to monitor participation and retention, that is attendance, absences, communication, and vacancies, and working closely with department CBAC leaders to assess and refine these systems, processes, and tools. OCI will strengthen and sustain that direct support to departments, collaborating, advising, training, mentoring county staff to use new systems, processes, and tools to request and collect demographic data and move beyond just representation as a checkbox, but to also invite and facilitate conversations about dimensions of diversity on advisory committees, normalizing intersectional thinking, integrating discussions about identity with budget matters and input on resource allocation, and empowering departmental CBACs to help build the diverse teams that we seek to engage. So it is a process, and I want to assure you that this body of work is an absolute priority for our office. So I'm here to listen and to answer questions to the best of my ability, whether that's today or in follow-up. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you being here, Amada. I will turn it over to the board if there are any questions about these appointments or anything else that Amada had.
Thank you.
We'll start with Commissioner Jones-Dixon.
Thank you, Chair. I have no questions at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Brim Edwards.
Good morning. I'm going to ask a few questions, and since I requested that these actually be placed on the regular agenda instead of the consent agenda, and I thought it was important to do that just as we sort of turn the page. As you noted, there's been some very significant changes in our code and the approach, and I will say when I first joined the commission, it was surprising to me that some of the community budget advisory committees had sort of robust engagement and were providing, I felt, really timely, insightful advice into the budget process, and others, one seemed like they had languishing due to lack of either engagement or membership. So I I appreciate the code changes that have been brought forward, and looking forward to a much more robust process. I appreciate the changes that were proposed around representation to have more diverse in a variety of diversity and representation. And one of the things that I was specifically interested in was the equitable geographic representation, just given what seemed to be low representation from District 3 on the CBACs. And we certainly, I know from talking to my neighbors in the district that people have perspectives and insights to offer the county process. So I'm glad that that's been incorporated. I did send you some questions last week and just wanted to get them on the record as well, and I'll submit them. But one of the other areas that I was concerned about, in addition to low levels of participation from my district, is that there were out-of-county residents who seemed to be having preference over county residents on our community budget advisory committees. And so I'm glad that we have a preference now. And I have some just general questions about the process and our engagement. In terms of the community budget advisory committees, were there individuals who applied but did not actually make it onto the committees, or were not selected? And maybe you could just tell kind of the process by which, if somebody applies, it's not automatic, but what process would be led to that somebody didn't get selected?
Thank you for that question. We had 12 applicants that were not selected. 7 of them withdrew. One person selected was not accepted because they were employed by Multnomah County. Someone else because they were already on a joint office advisory board. Another person selected withdrew after applying. They applied after the process. One was not selected through the interview process, and that is done through interviews that are evaluated through a rubric. And then one was not selected due to an administrative error. So that's a little bit of a snapshot of those individuals for this particular cycle.
So generally, the majority of people who applied and went through the application process and the interview process were selected.
Yes.
Are coming forward as appointments. Thank you. Very useful to know. And then when the code changes originally came forward, there was a question about the county not having the appointment dates, so knowing what the true tenure. And this, I think, falls into the sort of maybe category of operational excellence. And can you share what you've done since that time? Because I think it was a legitimate issue that's been raised, and I appreciate the information that you've provided. So about how going forward, we're going to have that information and how it'll be monitored.
Yeah, thank you for that. As I mentioned, we're moving towards Better Impact, which is a volunteer management system, one that the library and the animal services system use. It is going to be a game changer for us in terms of being able to collect that information and in a centralized way, and then use that information programmatically to identify a wide range of issues related to the diversity that we are seeking on, on our CBACs, but also in terms of being able to look more critically at why people are leaving, more about what their identities are. So I think that will be a huge improvement. In addition to that, though, I do think that we need another sort of mechanism for tracking attendance and participation, absences, communication. All of that, I think, is really important in the day-to-day support of the CBAC. So I think these two tools together will be really helpful in that effort. And we've just seen that there are lots of systems that is sort of broken down along the way, and being able to hold that information.
I appreciate that, because just knowing what the actual terms of services is seems like a fundamental piece of information that we need to know in order to be able to make appointments. So thank you for the work that's happened since the issue got raised. And then the last question I have relates somewhat to going back to the geographic representation. I think I had never seen the CBAC appointments in the sense of here's where the districts they come from. And I know Commissioner Moyer was very happy with the outcome, given her the overrepresentation of some of the other districts. I'm curious, so going forward, I'm supportive of the appointments this. I know. Well, I'm going to get to that. So I'm supportive of the appointments this morning. I really appreciate everyone who stepped up, who applied, raised their hands. And I'm wondering going forward if we have this goal of more geographic representation. Obviously, we have heading into the budget process. How do you see, I guess, Commissioner Jones-Dixon and I really helping create that more robust engagement and participation from our districts so that we have that sort of East Portland, East County viewpoint and perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Well, we will add it to the application. I think that's a big issue. I think also what we're looking at is creating a tool that allows us to be able to operationalize these preferences that we've put into code in an intersectional way. So I think once we're able to assess teams in terms of what we have in terms of representation and what we're missing and setting goals, recruitment goals around that, that's going to be really powerful. I think the other is that OCI can do a better job partnering with your offices to engage you all in helping us to recruit. So we sent each of your offices a sort of recruitment media packet that had, different ways of sharing our recruitment effort for the community involvement committee, which is a different committee, but we really see us as a roadmap for CBACs. And there are other partners that we can recruit as recruiters too that are in your districts that can help us do that work and do it better. I think moving to year-long outreach and recruitment is going to significantly help that. Historically, our office has only done outreach for a set 3 months. I don't think that has been done in service to our goals for representation and diversity. So having equal representation from all districts will now be centered in our work to build diverse teams. And I think that can happen at every stage, from outreach to recruitment to selection to appointment and retention, which I think is also something that we want to really elevate in the work that we're doing.
I appreciate that. And I hope that as, I know we're filling out some seats, but as openings come up, that we prioritize trying to seek that balance as we go along, in addition to when the big push, when there's more openings. Because I know that I will want to be helpful and sort of elevate participation in my district. And thank you again for answering all my questions and the work that you did, because I feel like we're in a much better position. You and your team, we're much better position with the code changes. And I feel like some pieces of more information being, foundational information being in place so that we can move ahead in a thoughtful way and actively engage our community in the budget process.
Thank you, Commissioner Brim-Edwards.
Thank you. Commissioner Singleton.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Director. I continue to appreciate the work that you're doing to evolve this process. I do just want to highlight, you made a comment about equal geographic representation, and that may not completely align with the diversity that we're looking for across other demographic areas. So I hope that we'll move forward really looking at taking an analysis across demographics to understand where there's a lack of representation so that we can be thoughtful and intentional about recruitment. I also want to appreciate you for working so closely with my team in some of the social media push that we've been able to do and getting and trying to actively recruit folks. So I think that's something that my team has shared with you and hopefully can be shared with other commissioners to just help kind of push that messaging out by district. So thank you for your ongoing work, and I look forward to seeing a snapshot, hopefully in the near future, on all these demographics.
Thank you, and I appreciate you calling out the word equal. I do think that usually I use the word equitable in my work around outreach and recruitment, but I think in the case of geographic representation, that there is a want for equal representation intersected with equitable. So I appreciate you calling that out and want you to know we certainly understand the difference and how important that is to building the diverse teams that we seek to engage. So thank you. And thank you for the big push to recruit for the CIC. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Moyer.
Yes, thank you. It is sad not to see a lot of district when I'm kidding. I'm fine with that. I just would like to thank everybody who went through the application process and was willing to give of their time for the benefit of the county and their fellow residents. It is sometimes not everyone's dream to spend their free time in bureaucratic meetings. Although I actually like it. I understand that that's not everyone's cup of tea, but I really wanted to just say thank you. I don't know if anybody is in the audience or might be watching who is being put forward today or is in the process of wanting to join one of our advisory committees, but I am really grateful for their service. I take their recommendations seriously and I really appreciate the time and expertise that they're bringing. I read through the bios of everyone. I'm excited for their input and just wanted to thank them for being willing to do this.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amada. I will say, I think having, seen the CBACs go through over 8 different budget cycles, I don't know that we've ever had equal numbers of people from different districts, but I think a good goal is trying to minimize the differences between the numbers in the districts, but recognizing that for whatever reason, sometimes, whether it's because you're trying to bring different perspectives or people who just have certain experiences, it's really hard to have exactly equal. I think the important thing is that we have this diverse perspective, including geographic diversity,
Yes.
and people who are really committed to the work of helping the county and advising us on the budget process. So I just want to put that out there because it's something that we should keep in mind, but I don't want us to, let perfection be the enemy of the good and what we're trying to achieve by this. So thank you for your work on this. We do have one person who signed up for public testimony, so I'm going to invite them up and then we will move forward.
Thank you.
Charles Johnson.
Good morning again. I'm Bridge Crane Charles Simca Johnson, and alas, I'm just here to heap more stuff on Senora Perez's plate. But it probably falls under the scope of the work plan she already has, except poor OCI, because I guess we can also say that they're responsible for all advisory committees, not just budget advisory committees. I don't know. And I think that means we have to look at the plan, how many FTEs she has, how many people they have, and what their fluency is with Tableau and other things. Because I think really all of you can agree that as we work for this goal of having equitable budget advisory committees with equality, which, right there's one problem. You can only have geographic equality when there's precisely either 4, 8, or 12 people on the committee. Otherwise, it doesn't math. But my main thing, since I mentioned Tableau and other horrid or wonderful online tools, is really when we complete this process, we should be at a place where not only you and the county staff, but everybody can just go to multco.us, and maybe it's like /OCI, and under OCI, it will have a list of the departmental budget committees and the other advisory committees, and people will just be able to blah, 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 and see how great we're doing. How 4 districts all have 4 people each, and we've got, I don't think we can go up to 16, but what if we had that level of engagement from people, or level of frustration with what's happening in Washington, D.C., that people just flock into the budget advisory committees and the regular committees. So I think that covers it. I don't need to use my whole 3 minutes. I don't have a yellow blinking light yet. Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Thank you. All right. Well, appreciate the conversation.
I cut you off. I do think I should outdo Commissioner Moyer and say, thank you, Amanda Guerin. Thank you, Lisa Drennan. Boy, this is not fun to do on a phone. Thank you, Wendy Lair. Those are 3 people for districts 2, 3, and 4. Ooh, nice. And 3 people, 4 for the Sheriff's Department. Erica, love you, phone. Erica Gregg, Faye Reynolds, biography is forthcoming. Justin Hobson from District 3, and Rochelle Ross Shank, who's bringing some out-of-county experience. Thank everybody, those people and other volunteers for the various committees.
All right, thank you. All right, Marina, can we have a roll call vote?
Commissioner Moyer,
Yes.
Commissioner Singleton,
Yes.
Commissioner Brim Edwards,
Yes?
Commissioner Jones Dixon,
Yes.
Chair Vega Peterson.
Aye, the appointments are approved.
R2, Shelter Referral Board Briefing.
All right, so as folks are coming down, this is a really great briefing for us to have, especially for new board members, to have this discussion. Providing emergency shelter and the associated emergency services that come alongside those needing shelter are really part of the cornerstones for our approach of addressing homelessness, and for good reasons. We know that shelters are spaces people can find safety and belonging while learning about and accessing the services they need to become more stable in their lives and move forward towards better health, jobs, permanent housing, and new beginnings. Each of our shelters uses trauma-informed practices to make sure that no matter where someone is seeking shelter, they're treated with dignity, care, and consideration. Today is an opportunity to look more closely at one aspect of this ongoing work. Our fiscal year 2025 adopted county budget last June included a budget note from our District 3 Commissioner, Julia Brim Edwards, requesting that the Homeless Services Department provide this board a briefing on the practices and policies of referring to shelters with geographic information of individuals who are referred to and use shelters. The note also requested information on trends of the number of unsheltered individuals and where they are living unsheltered and the location of shelters they are referred to. All of this gives us a chance today to look more closely at who is in our shelters, where they come from as a means to better understand shelter referral practices to inform our future work. I know that it has taken the Homeless Service Department a great deal of time, energy, and effort to put together this data, and I am very appreciative of the work that got us to today and will help us to continue to consider our shelter system from here. I'm now happy to turn things over to Anna Plum and Doc Ramblings from the Homeless Services Department. Good morning, and thank you for being here.
Madam Chair, before we head to that, can I just share what prompted me to ask for the budget note, just for the new commissioners?
Sure, go ahead.
So as I was out in talking to both individuals who were seeking shelter, but also who were being served in our shelters, one thing that came up frequently was that individuals who were in adjacent neighborhoods who were houseless in that particular community around a shelter didn't actually have access to the shelter, and a frustration that the services that were being provided in various parts of the city, in my case, in Southeast Portland, that shelter, the frustration that they weren't having access to the shelter. So I was interested in how the shelter referral process was happening, and in some ways the sort of the opaqueness that just raised questions for people about how you would actually access shelter that was in your community but not actually available. So that is what, and so I'm always like, having data sometimes answers questions, or sometimes it raises new questions, or leads to policy changes. So I felt like instead of coming to a conclusion about what was happening, that ask for data was the most important place to sort of just start the discussion. So I really appreciate the work and bringing forward the information. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. All right, we'll turn it now over to Doc and Anna.
Good morning. We'll start with introductions. My name is Anna Plum. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Homeless Services Department.
And my name is Doc Ramblings. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a Research Evaluation Analyst Senior for the Homeless Services Department.
Okay, so I want to start, you will notice I said Homeless Services Department. This slide says Joint Office of Homeless Services. I apologize, we're in that weird transition phase, so we built this slide with Joint Office of Homeless Services. To Mr. Johnson's point, it's a little bit confusing. We will be transitioning to Homeless Services Department more formally. I'm definitely in alignment with our budget work sessions. All of those will have the Homeless Services Department branding on them, so I apologize for the little bit of the acronym confusion during this presentation. Next slide, please. Oh, there we are. I'm just going to wait for the presentation. Okay. That's okay. This is okay with me. Can you all see on your screens? Okay. So as the chair mentioned, this presentation is in response to a budget note from D3 in last year's budget process. The text of the budget note is here on the slide, and essentially it asks for a couple different things. Information on the practices and policies of referral to shelters, tied with the geographic information of folks who are referred to and use shelter. It asked for trends on numbers of unsheltered folks, and then also where those folks are living and the location of the shelter they are referred to and use. Next slide, please. There are obviously a few questions embedded within that, and we have varying levels of data available when this request was made. Not all of the information is actually available on a systematic basis. For example, we do not systematically collect data on where someone was prior to entering a shelter or other services, and we'll talk more about the why to that as we get into the presentation. But we did have time to prepare for this note, and so Doc did a variety of studies to help us answer those questions, at least on a pilot basis. So we're going to walk through the different aspects of the budget note in the order that you see here. We'll start with an update on our progress towards those new unsheltered individual counts. We'll talk about where people are experiencing unsheltered homelessness based on the data that we do have. We'll talk on the practices and policies around referral to shelters, and then we will look at the previous locations of folks entering shelter based on some pilot studies that Doc was able to do, or a pilot study. Next slide. So this is where we are with the unsheltered trends. As you know, last January, we released our new by name list that showed there were 5,394 people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We have been working on a new suite of population dashboards. Those dashboards will do a couple things we're really excited about. One is it will show on a monthly basis the deduplicated number of folks experiencing homelessness. That will include who is in shelter, who is unsheltered, and then if there are folks we're not sure where they are, but we know that they are homeless. So that will be a monthly snapshot. It will also have monthly data on inflow, outflow, and some demographics. So who is entering homelessness and who is exiting, with some large categories for why that is happening. And then we will have some demographics on the folks who are experiencing homelessness. Race, age, and gender are some of the things we'll be able to look at. I had really hoped that I would be displaying those new dashboards for you today. That was originally timed to be released January or February of this year. It is now towards the end of February. We have had some delays, specifically in the effort to deduplicate the information that we have. We understand that 5,300 folks likely has some duplication in it, and we've been working on what is a relatively complicated project to deduplicate the data in our database and also in the numbers that we pull out. We are working through that, and I feel relatively confident we will have that done in the next month, which after a little bit of QA will mean we'll have that information up in the next few months. We do have a plan B that we will use if we continue to have those concerns. So what I would like you to know is we hope to have updated information for you very, very soon. We will prepare a full memo for the board when all that data is available, and we can also walk you through the dashboards as they become live. So I regret to say we don't have that yet, and we're working very, very hard. We are working with our vendor. We're meeting with them. They're giving us updates every day. We are meeting with IT on a regular basis, so we're really all in and trying to get this going as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. I am now going to transition to Doc to talk a little bit about where people are living unsheltered.
And once again, my name is Doc Ramblings. I'm a Research Evaluation Analyst Senior for the Homeless Services Department. And so the next topic we'd like to address is where people are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We currently have a few different ways of exploring this question, the first of which is our biennial street count survey. This survey is conducted every 2 years as part of the HUD point in time or pit count. So we did that in 2023, and then we just completed this process again last month, and that data is expected to be available in April. We also know the information the City of Portland collects on campsite reports can be used by outreach workers to target their efforts. And while the city's impact reduction map only shows sites that have been removed or plan to be removed, it still provides some insight into the geographic trends of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. In the future, we're also hopeful that our new Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS implementation, will include a geolocation feature as part of our outreach efforts in data collection. We've included this aspect in a recent request for proposals for our new HMIS contractor, and we're currently moving through the evaluation process with several prospective providers. Next slide, please.
Sorry, that's the only copy I have, unfortunately.
Do you all have a map on your screen?
We have printed maps right next to us.
Those printed maps are for later in the presentation. You should have on your screen a map that shows the point in time street count results.
Yeah, let's see.
How many pages are we blank here?
Marina, I will share the slides with you real quick.
So Marina, the copy that's on the board meeting materials has all of the information in it if you want to share it from there.
Okay.
Instead of just the PDF, the Adobe Reader.
It's just opening so small on here. That's the only thing. Sorry. Click out of it, I guess.
So what if just go to the Multnomah County Board meeting? That's the one that I did, like this.
Where is this one right here? Like,
While we're reading, I'm just going to take a moment to thank Doc for your service at the homeless, the shelter, the warming shelter at Ascension Church, and welcoming me in last week. So thanks for the work you and the team did in Southeast.
Yeah, we appreciate you commissioners coming out to see how things look when we open those. It's really important work.
thank you. Okay, I think we are back where we need to be. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with us for that few minutes.
All right, so now we'd like to share a few maps. This first map shows the results from that 2023 Pitt Street Count Survey that I just mentioned, and we can create a similar map with the 2025 results once they become available. This survey asks where people were sleeping on the previous night from the count, with the option to choose from one of the geographic areas pictured on this map. It's important to note that this map only reflects those approximately 1,600 people who were surveyed as part of the street count, and then this number is later combined with our HMIS data to reach the total count that was included in the 2023 report. I'll give you all a second to look at this, and then we can go to the next slide.
You have a question?
Yeah, this map doesn't cover Southwest, like lower Southwest Portland. Is that part of the red and it just doesn't show, or?
I believe it's hiding behind the tech. There you go.
Got it, okay. That goes, okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. All right, so this next map shows the location of all the JOHS-funded shelters in Multnomah County. The 3 domestic violence shelters that we fund are not included on this map because they have confidential locations. The shelters are color-coded by shelter type, and Anna is going to describe the different types of shelter in more detail in a few slides. This map also identifies our family shelters, our youth shelter locations, as well as the 4 behavioral health shelter programs funded through the Homeless Services Department. A similar version of this map is publicly available on our website, and it also includes additional details about each shelter location. Next slide, please. All right, so this map overlays the previous two maps, allowing us to compare the 2023 Pitt Street Count survey results with the current locations of JOHS-funded shelters. This information is really useful when deciding where and how to expand our shelter system. Generally speaking, as you can see on the map, the areas with the highest concentration of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness also have higher numbers of shelter programs. The results of the most recent Pitt Street Count will be taken into consideration once they become available. And now I'm going to hand it back to Anna to talk a bit about our shelter referrals.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk through the shelter referral practices and policies. If you don't know, I will tell you 17 more times in the next several years. Our homeless services system is broken up into 4 major systems of care. There is a system of care for families, for youth, for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and a system for adults. We also have a smaller veteran system, but these are the 4 we tend to talk about. They all have different shelter referral practices and policies, and I'm going to walk through them from most simple to most complicated. Spoiler alert, the adult system is the most complicated, so we'll spend a lot of time on that. Next slide, please. This talks about the referral processes for both the family and the youth shelter systems. All placements at family shelters are referred through coordinated access. So that is a process where a family calls, most of the time they call 211, but they can also be assessed by any of our family system navigators and a variety of folks who are able to perform this task. And they are assessed in terms of what their need is, their vulnerability, and their eligibility for a shelter program. If they are either put on a wait list or they are placed into shelter, depending upon those results. When folks are placed into shelter in the family system, geographic location is considered. If possible, they try to place folks with proximity to the school the children might attend or work where the parent is. The data on this is not collected, and I'll speak again to that later, but it is something they try to take into account. It's not always possible given the limited number of shelter units, but that is how the family system works. The youth system has 2 shelters. One of them is overnight only, and it's first come, first served, and youth can self-refer, or someone could refer a youth in as well. The second shelter has longer stays, and that is filled via case manager referral, and that program does lead with connections to programs and placement. That shelter tries not to have a waiting list for placement out of shelter into housing, so the stays remain relatively short in that shelter as well. Next slide. The domestic and sexual violence survivor system has multiple referral pathways. There is an ability to self-refer, first come, first serve. Folks can also access the shelters via the Gateway Center, the County Crisis Line, and by system advocates. We have advocates that do things like, for example, like go into other shelter sites or other places where there are services. And if someone has a DSV survivor need, they might be referred to the DSV system. Similar to the family system, advocates do try to take geographic preference into account when placing folks into a shelter. Again, if there are children in the household, the idea is to keep those children close to their school, if the person is working, to keep them close to their work. And also, it's taken into account in terms of safety, the sort of distance from someone who might be unsafe. That is not always possible. Again, there are only 140 units of shelter across the 3 DSV shelters, so it's not always possible, but that is something that they try to take into account. Next slide. Okay, we're going to spend several slides on the adult system. It is a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to start by reviewing the shelter type because there are some commonalities between shelter type and referral type as well. I do want to acknowledge at the start, the categories of adult shelter can and are causing some confusion, and we are working with the city as we build towards our budget work sessions to be consistent in what we call different kinds of shelter. So this is a little bit of a transition phase. I'm going to focus on 3 major types of shelter. Congregate shelter, which was what a lot of folks think of when they think of shelter. That's multiple adults in a room, sleeping on mats or bunk beds or cots. There are sometimes more private rooms within. Alternative shelters, where we get a little bit complicated. This typically is single room, standalone shelter units, sometimes referred to as pods. They usually have electricity, heating and cooling, windows and doors, but separate bathrooms and kitchens, as the plumbing is not in those pods. I hope that we're going to start talking about alternatives sort of on a larger basis. I do want to note that we have some models at the bottom of the slide. The larger alternative city shelters are also what I would consider alternative shelter, but we sometimes call them by the names that they were created with, which is TAS and SRV. So we will speak to those a little bit interchangeably today. Other kinds of alternative shelter are our smaller village model, which is similar in terms of where folks, what the pod the person is living in, but it's a smaller number of units, and there's a different sort of governance structure for those. And then we also have motel shelters, which are motels or hotels that have been repurposed into shelter. And the health department does have some shelter that is somewhat congregate-like, but it has specific population, service people with specific medical needs. Next slide, please. That was shelter type, and we have two sort of major referral types. We talk about open referral and closed referral. So an open model is basically where folks can self-refer themselves into shelter, or anyone could refer someone into that shelter. And then the closed referral is where only certain folks have the ability to refer people into that shelter. And within the open referral system, there's sort of two main ways that it works. Shelters that have a self-referral, some of them have an email, some of them have a phone number, some of them have a form, some of them use all three. And there are two shelters that are resource centers that have shelter beds attached. So both the BHRC, which stands for Behavioral Health Resource Center, and Bud Clark Commons have resource centers that are also linked to shelter units. A closed referral system, again, that means only certain groups can refer people, and this does work differently in different scenarios. When we say community partner, that means that certain community partners can refer into that shelter, such as a church or a service provider or a medical care provider. Internal referral basically means a referral within a provider or a small provider system. So for example, we might have a provider that has both outreach, congregate, and motel shelter, and they might refer among those programs. So an outreach worker might be able to refer someone into the congregate shelter. We'll also see later that a lot of the times motel placements are referrals from congregate shelter. So that's what we mean by internal referral within a provider system. Coordinated access is, again, someone being assessed via the coordinated access program and being deemed to be eligible for a certain shelter. The last three, the Portland Street Services Coordination Center, the navigation teams, and the Portland Fire and Portland Street Response work together on a system where they are eligible to refer sort of in partnership to a certain set of shelters, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. So this is an attempt to marry, like I said, there's some overlap between shelter type and referral method. Most of our congregate shelters have open referral pathways. There are some that have sub preferences, like there is, you need to be abstinent from substances for one shelter, and there is one that is reserved for veterans. Many of our alternative shelters outside of the TAS and SRV sites are open referral pathways, but some of them do have a culturally specific referral process. The majority of the motels are referrals from congregate shelters, so it's not necessarily open. And again, some of them do have a culturally specific pathway, and there are a few other pathways with motels as well. We have one that is designated for folks who have a medical need to isolate, and so they're referred from hospitals and other care systems, for example. Within the health department, access to BHRC beds comes from the BHRC Day Center, and there are some new narrative behavioral health beds that are referred into by case management. Within the TAS and SRV sites, those are filled via the Street Services Coordination Center, that's what SSCC means, and select navigation teams. So the way that works is those navigation teams kind of rotate depending upon where there are open spots, and they're eligible to refer into that. We also see there's a circle for the shelter set-aside program. There are 100 beds that are set aside across 11 different shelters, and those are referred into by the Street Services Coordination System. Those are specifically for folks who are displaced by the Homelessness and Urban Camping Impact Reduction Program at the City of Portland. So that is also somewhat of a closed referral system. Next slide. This is an attempt to sort of just visualize the numbers. So you can see that for congregate, most of those are open. The two that we consider closed would be Bybee Lakes, as that has sort of a sobriety element, and then the Gresham Women's Center. The alternative shelters are primarily open. The two that are closed are the St. John's Village, which requires you to be eligible for HUD-VASH, it's a veterans, and then We Shine Avalon, which is filled via coordinated access. Motels primarily are closed, and again, that just means it's an internal referral that has an associated process. And then, as noted, the SRVs and TAS are primarily closed, serving those 3 entities that I mentioned. There are 2 that have a more open referral process. Those are our culturally specific shelters for folks who are LGBTQIA2S+ and or BIPOC. So they're open, but they do have a culturally specific referral process. Okay, switching topics slightly. Next slide, please. As the commissioner mentioned, there is a conversation to be had about geographic preference in filling shelter units. As of right now, referrals to adult shelter do not usually prioritize referrals based upon their location, with some important caveats. Many shelters begin with neighborhood preference upon opening. Our Good Neighbor Agreement template actually includes a policy to concentrate referrals to the shelter at opening, those initial referrals from folks living unsheltered in proximity to that site. We've implemented this in multiple shelters, and that is the plan for Oak Street Village, which had its soft launch yesterday. That is not necessarily something that we have built into ongoing shelter referrals at this time. Up until this point, sort of our perspective is that appropriate shelter placement is based upon individual service needs, identity, and equity. That being said, we're in the process of, this board briefing was part of this, looking at mapping all our referral policies, which we just did, and thinking about what that looks like moving forward. We know it's time for a community conversation specifically about the adult shelter referral process, and I do think that geographic preference is going to be a major part of that conversation. Next slide, please. I gave away my next slide. So I went too fast. We are in the process of thinking about that process improvement. So we have mapped all the referral pathways, which we did for this presentation. And we are hoping to begin a process to look again as a community across all the jurisdictions and across the shelter providers, what it might look like to standardize shelter referral policies and processes. The goal there would be to eliminate barriers to entry, to improve accessibility, and also to improve equitable access to shelters to make sure that they're accessible to all in an equitable way. That is going to be a pretty intensive conversation. We've got a lot of shelter providers, we have a lot of jurisdictions, and so we're in the beginning phases of that. We look forward to moving that forward in the next few months. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to transition. I have one more slide, and then Doc will talk about location. One of the requests from the board briefing was, as folks enter a shelter, we would asking where they were before they entered that shelter to get a sense of how folks are moving around. This is one of those places where we do not collect that data in HMIS. We do not have that data across our system at this point. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, as you know, HMIS is built, it's built on service data. So as someone accesses a service, they are asked some information about themselves, and some of that is entered into the HMIS system. Providers do not ask or collect information on where someone was prior to entering a shelter at this point. This is mostly because it doesn't impact service eligibility. HMIS was designed for federal compliance, and that is not something that we're required to report to the federal government. And as we've discussed, our current HMIS system is a little bit clunky, so providers tend not to enter any extra information they don't have to. But it also is because people who are accessing services are providing a lot of personal information all the time, and they are being asked a lot of personal questions every time they access a service. And the more that we add to that, the more that we add barriers to folks who are just trying to get into a place to sleep. Specifically, when you think about asking someone where you were last night, if that person is camping in a place that nobody else knows about, that feels safe to them, they may not want to share that. If they are in a room full of people, they may not want people to know, oh, I left my stuff over here, you can go check it out. So asking someone to share that on a consistent basis is a burden for providers as they're trying to just get folks into a service. So that's one of the reasons we don't collect it. It does make answering this question challenging, and we are working towards having location documented in our outreach programs. Last year, as a part of Housing Multnomah Now, we did pilot a tool called Survey 123, which allowed outreach workers who were out collecting data via that tool to collect the geographic data of where they were when they collect that information and had that conversation. As Doc noted, this is also something we're building into our HMIS procurement. We are in the process of that procurement. We will be reviewing sort of the top proposals in the next several weeks, and we were very clear that we were looking for an outreach tool that allowed us to collect geographic location as we move forward. I will say, we don't have this data systematically, but we knew this was an interest. So DOC created a pilot program to collect data on folks who are entering shelter, and he will speak to that now.
Yeah, so as Anna mentioned, we don't normally collect that information. So in order to get a better understanding of what that might look like, we implemented a 2-month data collection pilot from October to November of last year. We were able to include 8 shelters from 3 different providers, and we selected those shelters based upon some different factors. We wanted to consider geographic spread and include shelters from across the county in different districts. We generally tried to select shelters with higher capacities to ensure an adequate number of entries. And then we also wanted to include some non-congregate shelters, which is why we have 2 motel shelters and an SRV. However, as expected, those non-congregate shelters had a much lower number of entries than the congregate shelters did. And finally, we had to consider the data collection capacity of our providers. Some providers have dedicated data staff, others are smaller and more limited in that capacity. So during the 2-month pilot, we had a total of 465 individuals enter these 8 shelters, and around 70% of those people came from unsheltered situations. A little more than a quarter were coming from previously sheltered or housed situations. Next slide, please. So this slide will provide some granularity around the different kinds of responses people provided regarding their previous living situation. Many of the unsheltered situations were described vaguely as outside, on the streets, or something similar. Others specified that they were living in a tent or a vehicle. Among the individuals coming from previously sheltered situations, those were folks leaving institutions, sometimes other shelters, and other types of housing. There are also a handful of participants that declined to provide that information, or some that just provided a response that was not clear enough to understand. I think it's important to point out here that the 123 people who are coming from previously sheltered locations may have very likely ended up sleeping outside somewhere in the community if they had not entered shelter. Preventing more people from experiencing unsheltered homelessness is part of our overall strategy to reduce homelessness in the community. And so another way to think about this is that we don't want someone to have to spend a night on the street before they're able to access shelter if it's needed. Next slide, please. So this chart breaks down the different types of shelter that people moved between among those who are coming from another form of shelter. The largest portion you can see is people coming from shelters that were not funded by the Joint Office, or sorry, the Homeless Services Department. That would include shelters like Portland Rescue Mission or Central Church of the Nazarene. There are 6 people moving from congregate to motel shelters, and this is kind of an expected flow due to the referral pathways where most of our motel shelters take referrals from congregate shelters. The other movement you see from congregate to congregate shelter or from congregate to motel within our funded shelters is likely about participants finding the right fit to meet their specific needs. Next slide, please. After this slide, we're going to share the map results of the data collection pilot, which show geographically where people were living before entering a shelter. Just want to make clear that some of the responses were too broad or too vague to be mapped, and then some people, as I mentioned, declined to provide the information. So in total, around 72% or 335 people provided a response that we could map. Among those 335 people, 28% came from a previously sheltered or housed situation, and 72% came from an unsheltered situation. In the interest of time, I'll be pretty brief with each of these maps and happy to answer any questions about them. And I want to point out that there is no map for one of the shelters that we included in the pilot because only 5 people entered the shelter during the pilot period and only 2 of the responses were able to be mapped. Next slide, please.
And these are the maps you have in front of you.
Yeah. For anyone viewing the PDF versions allow you to look at it in much greater detail, so bear with us as we look at it on these slides. We're going to start with the Willamette Center because it had the highest number of entries. Each of these maps has a purple star for the shelter location, and then red and green dots to indicate if the person was previously sheltered, which would be a green dot, or a red dot if they were unsheltered. For this shelter, we had 222 people enter during the pilot period, and we were able to map out 168 of those responses. The Willamette Center is a congregate shelter operated by TPI in District 1. It has 120 beds, and as Anna mentioned, some of these are included in the Shelter Set-Aside program. The shelter has open referrals, so people can self-refer. They also accept referrals from community partners. Some folks entering the shelter were actually living very close by outside before entering the shelter. Next slide, please. So this is actually the same map zoomed in on the more densely populated area. It's pretty congested. It can be kind of hard to make out, and it's actually behind the black box right now. But there were at least 8 individuals who were previously living unsheltered right nearby the shelter before entering. Next slide, please. All right, so Laurelwood Center is another congregate shelter. This one's located in District 3, also operated by TPI with 120 beds. They also accept self-referrals and referrals from community partners and have some of their beds accounted for in the shelter set-aside program. They had a fewer number of entries, 98 total during the pilot, and then 72 of those are mapped here. And similar to the other shelter, at least 7 people who entered were previously living unsheltered nearby. Next slide, please. So this one is also hiding behind our black box, but Walnut Park is another congregate shelter operated by TPI located in District 2. This one has 80 beds, and it had 51 entries during the pilot, with 35 of them able to be mapped. Unlike the previous 2 shelters, there were actually very few participants coming from East County to this shelter. Next slide, please. Center is another congregate shelter. This one is located in District 1, operated by TPI. They have 90 beds. This shelter is actually for men only, and they have a sobriety requirement and require ongoing case management for all their participants. They too retain some of their beds for shelter set-aside program. They also have open referrals and accept referrals from community partners. They had 45 people enter during the pilot, and we were able to map out 32 of these entries. Similar to the last one, they actually had no entries coming from District 4 or out in East County. Next slide, please. All right, so Y East is a congregate shelter operated by Do Good Multnomah. This one's in District 3. They have 110 beds. They prioritize veterans at this shelter, and it's also part of the shelter set-aside program. Do Good's congregate shelters normally have open referrals, but at this time, Do Good Multnomah is only accepting referrals for veterans into their congregate shelters. This shelter had 24 entries during the pilot period, and we were only able to map 15 of those. This one has kind of an outlier hidden behind the black box. One participant was previously living outside of the county in Clackamas County. Next slide, please. All right, so this is our motel shelter. This is Stark Street, operated in District 4 by Do Good Multnomah. For alternative and motel shelters, we count the capacity in units rather than beds, as some units can house more than one person. So this shelter has 43 units total, and they had 10 entries during the pilot period, 4 of which could be mapped. And as we mentioned in the referral process, this is one of those motels where all referrals come from congregate shelter, which is why you won't see any red dots on this particular map. Next slide, please. And then last but not least is Menlo Park. This is an alternative shelter operated by Cultivate Initiatives located in District 3, and they have 50 units. This Safe Rest Village is a city shelter. They have closed referrals, which can only come from the Street Services Coordination Center, specific navigation teams, and city partners. They had 10 entries during the pilot period, and 7 of those were able to be mapped here. Overall, the maps show that in most cases, people from all over the county are being served at shelters. And then, as I said, I'm happy to provide any additional details or answer questions about any of the individual maps. Next slide, please. And so the last bit of information we wanted to share from the pilot is this table, which shows the participants' calculated average distance from the shelter they entered. So this is the calculated distance, not distance that the participant reported. And as you can see, the distances traveled to congregate shelters are pretty comparable. The lowest average distance for Clark Center is likely due to its proximity to the downtown area, where there's a very large concentration of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And alternately, the highest average at Y East was skewed by one person who entered the shelter that was previously located in Sandy. All right, so now I'm going to hand it back to Anna.
Next slide, please. So we've gone over a lot of information, and I just wanted to coalesce around the next steps. For the data dashboard, the next step there is we are working to finalize the deduplicated population counts, which we will then have up on our dashboard, and we will get you all a memo with the details of that information, any changes, and what we understand that to mean. In terms of shelter referral policies and geographic preference, we hope to have a community-wide discussion around shelter referral policies and working with our partners to align shelter practices specifically within the adult system. And that is all towards our goal of supporting effective shelters across the community. Next slide. That is the end of the presentation, but before we go to discussion and questions, we would like to show a couple videos from the comms team about the outreach.
In my younger years, I definitely struggled a lot with mental health. It runs in my whole family. And in my 20s and 30s, I've struggled to maintain housing. It is scary to not know where you're going to sleep, but your mind becomes so busy with trying to find food, shelter, that you can't even think about, how do I start getting on my feet again? Hey, Rhonda, do you guys want bananas or anything? Lived experience definitely plays a big role in why I would care to go outside and talk to people. I brought something for your doggies. Thank you, thank you. Yes. You know what? Some of the main things I do are a lot of case management with folks. Go out and meet people where they're at and build relationship. See maybe if they're interested in services, and that could be a lot of different things. Pie, put it in your fridge, please. Yes! And help folks transition from being outside to indoors. This is for you. Yay! It's not about just finding housing, it's about getting indoors. And then, do you think that Kyle could use this? Yes. Do you think so? But keeping it also. To find a safe place to be is pretty amazing. To see a shift in mood, but also maybe just more like a lust for life again. Favorite part of my job? Yeah. When someone goes inside and they get their keys. You could see people's physical change and mood lift by being inside. Most people want to live somewhere and just don't have the set of tools to get there yet. So I think this is beyond important. Okay, bye.
I went back to the same relationship like 9 times because of the lack of housing and places to go. Domestic violence thing for me has been, there's no help. There's just no help. I was fortunate enough to meet Kristen, and she did an evaluation and was awesome and helped me.
I told her I can talk to you and I can at least look at resources that are available. She was very active in the whole housing search. She was like, when can we meet? I'll be available. She never no-showed. She never canceled. She was always there, very involved. And I think she was surprised that we got the go-ahead so quickly.
There's so much to do that I'm going circles. You know, where do I start? If anybody's going to help you, it's them. Because I've been doing this for a long time, trying to get into some kind of a program and, you know, get overlooked. And to be able to go and talk to somebody that I trust to speak to is awesome.
Now seeing her in her dream apartment and how far she's come, that's something like that I give myself a little bit of permission to like celebrate.
I'm just really thankful. Really, I can't be more thankful. I'm so happy to be here. I can't even tell you how it feels for me, you know, to be able to get up in the morning and be safe.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation. And I just want to thank our comms team for producing those amazing videos of the Cascadia Health Outreach workers and the impact that they have. These are powerful, and I know that these have been spread. I saw it was in Cascadia's newsletter and the Wednesday Wire yesterday, so I'm glad that we had a chance to see those videos in this board meeting too. Before we go to the board for any questions or comments on this, I wanted to share with the board that I have sent a letter to Mayor Wilson to talk about our shelter system and specifically asking for a shift to an open referral process across our entire shelter system. So what we've had is we've had some pilots and some work really looking at those shelters sites which had been listed here of where the city is moving people through their work. And so my ask was to make that change so that we can really have referrals going in through outreach workers to our entire system, and asked that staff on the city side, staff on our homeless services department side to work out the details of what that looks like to move to that open referral system. As a part of that, we would be examining the bed utilization across the system. I think we need to have conversations about what it would look like to evaluate the referral system across the system, looking at the policy of the set-aside beds, right, and some of these things that where we really want to make. We want to have the biggest impact and really looking at how we're making the systemic changes across the system, and having that open referral system is a key step to doing that. The second part of that was asking, sharing that I had the homeless response system staff to look at the distribution of shelter services across our entire system, including the use of vouchers being used, housing vouchers to help people get to that next step beyond shelter, and really how that can be used across our system to ensure that the distribution of those vouchers is both equal and equitable, to refer to something that we were talking about at the last item, so that we can really, have the right information and have the right system set up to make sure that as we're evaluating any given site for its effectiveness in moving people from shelter into services, we're really talking about as even a playing field as possible. I think that's important for all of us, as well as the city electeds, to be able to have that conversation. And my expectation is that the next phase of the shelter availability tool is going to be needed to pull all of this off successfully. So I know the Dorn office is working on this. I think we're looking at this to get it online this spring. And so that is something that will help, I think, propel this work forward and have this switch to more open referral system really have the most impact. Okay. With that, I will go to the board for questions, and we'll start with Commissioner Broome-Edwards.
Thank you. I'm interested in seeing the letter, and I think I would hope that this is part of our discussion that we have with the city next week and going forward. And I have some questions related to our relationship with the city sites. I'm going to start by saying I really appreciate the work that was done. I can't imagine how much time it took to actually gather the information and understand the constraints that you had in gathering it. But to me, it does provide I'll just acknowledge data is always a snapshot in time. But to me, it does provide some interesting insights about trends, about locations. And I want to, I guess, just also start by just saying that I'm really going to be interested in the dashboard. I think last time I asked about it, Director Fields said it was imminent, so I was like waiting in January, and now it sounds like it's still imminent. And I would hope that we immediately get a briefing on that, the dashboard, because I think right now, again, sort of progress is, the definition is elusive, because we actually may be backsliding and we don't even know it because we don't have that inflow and outflow data of like how many people are actually unsheltered. So I'm looking forward to that and request that we have a briefing on it when we have that material. One of the things that I was curious about is that when I look at the maps, there wasn't a west side shelter that was, any data was gathered on. There's a lot of movement from the west side to shelters on the east side, but I'm curious about that particular piece, especially in light of the imminent closure of, did I miss a west side one?
Yeah, I think there was a map of Clark Commons.
Clark?
That's in D1, but not on the west side.
It's on the east side.
Yeah, it's on the other side of the river.
So
Not to tell you what's in your district, but however.
there's a couple different similarly named ones, and I think that's where the confusion lies. Yeah.
And I'm asking, just thinking about the imminent closure of Duguid Multnomah with a, and sort of quote, the replacement, which I don't view really as a replacement, is Beds Up Bybee Lake. And so, again, this goes to the geographic question. There seems to be a lot of movement in the maps from individuals, a concentration of individuals from downtown on the west side to sites on the east side. So I'm curious about just whatever observations you might have on that, or maybe share what you, why there wasn't anything from the west side focused on, and then what sort of trends that you see from the data, because it looks like there's this migration of the referrals going into the east side versus keeping people close to where their community is.
Yeah, I can't say that there was any intentionality behind not including a west side shelter. That's just a bit of oversight on my part, I suppose. Given the, limited, there's only the 4 shelters down there, or 3 now that are congregate. Just didn't end up landing with one of those shelters. Also, the shelter set-aside bed programs were where we started with mapping out our shelter availability tool. So that's where we had the most connection and insight into the shelter practices. As far as the trends part, there is definitely a large number of unsheltered people downtown on the west side. So it would probably be interesting to see how many of those folks are moving into west side shelters versus shelters in other locations.
Yeah, well, I guess that's why I'll also be interested in the dashboard, because I'll say, just speaking from being all over the east side, there may be more spread out, but there definitely are large concentrations of people without shelter. It may be more visible downtown or more reported, but I guess I would just note that as well. This is a broader question that comes up from the data, that given the intergovernmental agreement we have with the city of Portland, it's my understanding as part of that, the county will assume the operations of the temporary alternative shelter sites and the safe rest villages. Is that correct? That's my understanding.
So I will say we have delayed that transfer. The IGA said that transfer would happen July 1st. And so the letter that the chair referred to was formally saying, let's delay that transfer while we figure out what that looks like. I do think that question is related to what is happening in our budgets. And so one of the reasons I'm saying we'll start the shelter referral policy discussion the next couple of months is I feel like there's a couple of things we need to land first in terms of who is funding and who is operating what, and that will help us understand how better and more efficiently to have the conversation around shelter referral. For one of the things you said previously, I just want to be clear, the population dashboard will not have a geographic element to it because we do not have that data, but I don't want to put in expectations that don't exist.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in the dashboard because that will tell us actually, give us real data about how many people are sheltered and unsheltered. And when we say we've done X amount and we've increased, it actually may be an increase, but we actually have a larger problem and we just don't know it. So I'm curious that a suggestion was made in changing the IGA without the county, or
The delay is in the IGA. So the IGA allowed for a delay of that transfer. And so that we are not changing the IGA. It was just in alignment with the IGA. Let's delay until we can figure out what that looks like. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
so I would hope that the county commission would be having a discussion about that, because one of the things this great data shows is that it sort of reconfirms what I had thought, which is most of the closed referral system is really at the city sites, and that those city safe rest villages, the temporary alternative shelter sites, there's an opaqueness about how those referrals are happening. And I think in here, so I'm going to be very interested in our conversation about with the city about the referral, because I think what I heard you said is that there's not a geographic preference except for at the opening, because appropriate shelter placement, quote, is based on individual service needs, identity, and equity. I also thought I heard you say is most of the city referrals are based on impact reduction program or clearing campsites, which isn't based on service needs. It's based on we cleared somebody from a camp and we're going to refer them somewhere. So an interest I will have is a lot more visibility into how the sites that we're funding, what the referral process is, and that we understand how those actual referrals are made, not just the city decided they're going to remove camps and those people then have preferences in places in which there are places around where we have shelters that actually there are people who in the community who are houseless, who then are, their preferences being individuals who have their camps cleared or getting preference into a facility in which there may be, from an equity standpoint, people with needs right in that geographic area. So I appreciate the research, because I think it shows that we don't have a lot of information about how the sites that we're going to be funding and potentially operating, how those referrals are happening. So for me, that's going to be a very key thing, because again, when I talk to people who are unhoused in East Portland and their frustration of like, I can see that there's shelter available, but I can't access it, to me raises real questions about how the referral system is happening and our partnership with the city and how we actually address that. In terms of the closed referrals, does the joint office have insights into how those referrals are happening, or like tracing? Because I'm assuming you said we don't know where people came from, but if there's say an encampment that's been cleared and then the city is using that as a referral process, seems like there would be knowledge about where that person came from if it came from a encampment in Clermont. So I'm curious about what sort of insights Homeless Services Department has into that.
We don't have a ton of insight into where folks are coming from when they enter via that specific referral system. I do not know, those sites do use HMIS data about who is in the system, but again, they're not, I don't think, consistently collecting what camp that person came from, for example, if that person came from a camp. And there are navigation teams that are not necessarily associated with camping, but are often associated with a camp that's going to be cleared. So we don't have a ton of insight, but that's absolutely something we could talk about more with the city to see what they're seeing, at least anecdotally, how that looks to them. I did want to note there was one SRV in the pilot, which is also in District 3, and during the pilot period, they only had one person enter that shelter from downtown. So that is, again, a snapshot. It's one piece of information from a short pilot, but that is, to some extent, getting to your question.
Yeah, again, I just go to the conversations I've had with people who are houseless, is like that there's a reason they stay in their in the community, there's an individual, Will, who's known as like the mayor of 97th Street, who is very active with the houseless community. And it's like the expectation, my expectation would be if we have shelter available and pathways off the streets, that individuals who are in that community would have the ability to access shelter sites that were set. Again, I really appreciate the data. I think it will be useful for the conversation going forward. And I hope the conversation about the referral system and the county's engagement with the city around the IGA is a commission-wide discussion, because I think there's some really important implications for our strategy, our investments, especially coming into the budget cycle, and would appreciate seeing the letter that was sent to Mayor Wilson.
Yeah, thank you. And as I heard a little bit of this when I was in the bathroom, but Anna, thank you for trying to respond to that. So the letter that, the components of the letter that I shared with all of you at previously about the opening up the shelter system for the referral process and taking a look at the distribution of shelter services and all of that, that was part of a letter that was sent around the transfer provisions within the IGA, which is, part of the administrative duties for myself and the mayor's office in making sure that we are, moving the work that's listed in the IGA forward. I did want to share all of that, that information with all of you, and we can continue to have conversations about that. I'm very interested in here, but I think that it is, as we are thinking about what this looks like in terms of who's running which shelters and what that looks like in bringing people into those shelters as part of the work that our Homeless Services Department is doing with staff. There are these things that I think need to be figured out before we're talking about moving some things. And I know that there was interest on the city side from staff on maintaining the management of those shelters for the short term as we're working some of these things out.
So it's a question about that. If they were maintaining shelters, are they then going to be maintaining the closed referral system? Because that's what they have now, because we don't have any insight into. So if they retain it, would they continue to have a closed referral system that we don't have insights into?
So as I said earlier, the letter that I sent about saying that we will take a look at the timeline for the transfer also had an ask for the mayor to direct his staff to moving to an open referral system. So I will make sure everybody has a chance to see that letter. So we'll make sure it gets sent to your office. Okay. All right, thank you. Commissioner Singleton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation and the amount of work that went into this. As a former provider, I know this was not easy, so appreciate all of that. I've got a couple of comments, a couple of questions that I'll run through. One, I just want to note on slide 8, where you have the geographic distribution from the pit, that the point in time count that looks at where folks are at. I just want to highlight, because I was there, that the East County shelter site that was purchased was in consultation with all of the city managers of those East County cities. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about any additional shelters in that location that we're in consultation with those cities. I'm sure Commissioner Jones-Dixon is all over that, but I just wanted to highlight that because it looks a little skewed that we put a shelter where the location might be in comparison to what the data shows. On slide 10, you mentioned for family shelter access, it's 211 and all other assessors. Does that include all outreach workers? And I ask this because we have a large number in Multnomah County of unsheltered families.
My understanding is that it's anyone who can do the new MIST tool.
I would love for us to make sure all outreach workers are equipped to do that assessment so that when they are coming across families, they can refer into those programs as opposed to having folks call 211. On both of these, I guess on all of these, family and youth, I'm really interested as this process moves forward and you're doing the assessment to understand what the feedback is from the youth who are accessing these shelters and what the referral process feels like for them and if it's effective. And I would say that for every population to really understand what the participant feedback is. And I know that's not a small ask, so I'm happy to be as supportive or helpful as I can. And wonder if there's opportunity in partnership with folks like HRAP to help look at making sure that we're getting that assessment done.
We do have a pathways evaluation that is ongoing, which is looking at how folks move through shelter that I believe has a significant amount of participant sort of qualitative analysis, but I will confirm that and get back to you and we can discuss it further.
Thank you. Sorry, I said HRAP, so I'm just going to say Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative.
I knew what you meant.
On alternative shelters, your definition on slide 12, we used to include sites like Right to Dream 2 and Dignity Village, and Dignity Village might fit under that definition depending on how you're talking about governance structure. But I want to highlight the effectiveness of sites like Right to Dream 2 and make sure that we're not excluding them as we think about our homeless service system. I think you mentioned the 100 beds that are shelter set aside. I would be interested if we can disaggregate and understand the length of stay for those shelter beds as well as utilization rate disaggregated from our overall numbers. Not today, obviously. Sorry, bear with me. You mentioned some of the upcoming work will include considerations around geographic preference. I think there's another important component to this that wasn't talked about today, that these different programs have different exclusion policies and different lengths of exclusions, and that could have a really significant impact on people's ability to access those shelters. In addition to thinking about in this context, I just think it's a worthwhile exercise to understand the exclusion policies and make sure that they align with best practice and don't have any unintended consequences on who gets excluded and why, and that we make sure that people have access to services somewhere, even if it's not at that specific site. I'm almost there. Oh, on slide 19, you mentioned 69% of folks were previously unsheltered. What is the time frame for that number? Were they unsheltered over the last year, the last week?
That would be that they were unsheltered directly before entering. And then some participants also provided the length of time they had been in that situation, but it wasn't very consistent in the data.
Okay, thank you. And then I think, lastly, I just want to say that we have and will continue to have a number of conversations around shelter. I think the most important thing that I've found is the types of services at those shelters. I'm very much less interested in where folks are coming from to shelter and more interested on how they're getting out of that shelter. So I think it's really important that I know this was about a specific budget note, but really looking at those opportunities. And I want to just really excuse me, uplift. I appreciated you showing the outreach videos. And I want to just state really clearly, not everybody needs to go through shelter to get back into housing. It is vital that we have a lens towards what outreach work can do and make sure that we're resourcing those folks so that they can do housing placement and or get folks into temporary stays in hotels and motels as a part of their work. So when we talk about shelter, I'm always thinking about the gentleman you mentioned who might want to stay in the same neighborhood and maybe a right fit as an outreach worker as opposed to a congregate shelter or an alternative shelter. So just want to make sure that we're always keeping that lens into this work. And then I think overall, when we think about, again, the shelter components, it's going to be really important to me when we're examining which type and mix of shelters to fund and provide in light of some of the budget scenario that we're looking at, that we keep our eye on the need to get folks out of shelter. I'm going to keep saying this, so I will apologize for the next 6 months of me saying it is important that we don't just warehouse people. If we don't have pathways out of shelter, we have not ended a homelessness. People are still homeless when they're in shelter. And so I really hope we can find that right balance in having those authentic conversations here that I know will be a challenge, but we need to be able to have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Moyer.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, and I know this is a very broad overview, and there's a lot of nuance that we didn't get into. One is, as we look at family shelter and the process that we're using, I know that we have centered the use of HUD resources for family centers, and we have some families that are very reluctant to give information to a federal agency. And so I just want to make sure that we're making some local vouchers available in our family system so that we can make sure that those families have access to housing. Also thinking about the adult population specifically, I'm really interested in a future briefing breaking out from the adult population some specific subgroups and having a clearer sense of like what their path to service is. I get very nervous about a congregate shelter-centric model for people who that model may not be appropriate for, and what is their access to shelter. And so I did have a question about open referral. That does not mean that we would not have like population or culturally specific providers, correct? We would still have that, we're not changing that.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure. But an issue that I am concerned about, and Commissioner Singleton touched on this, is the policies of exclusion. And that I am concerned that that practice is not in compliance with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, because, and it's not always easy to tell, I understand, but if the behavior is a direct result of a disability, you cannot then exclude a person with a disability from a public service. That's not lawful. And so I am afraid we have created barriers to people with disabilities from having access to shelter. Now, I would argue that I don't actually think congregate shelter is a great placement for somebody who is experiencing acute behavioral health needs, but it's what we have. You know, we've had accessibility issues, we've had the whole gamut, but I'm really concerned that there is not a clear understanding of what Section 504 requires of us, and that the existence of an exclusion list in and of itself is probably illegal. Now, I have been talking, and I'm really very excited about my conversations with the Department of Homeless Services related to, you know, a mental health specific strategy so that we're more appropriately meeting the needs of that population. But I think our providers need to understand what their legal obligations are because they're providing a public service. And then we need to strategize with them about how to work with people who are experiencing this type of disability, but it is not lawful to exclude people based on disability. So, you know, and one nuance to what Commissioner Brim Edwards is bringing up around how the city is handling their shelter is their compliance with, I can't remember the statute reference, but it's House Bill 3115, which is the guidelines around when you can sweep an encampment and the requirement under Oregon law that you must offer an alternative. And so I'm very curious about that, and that then skews equitable access, because we know, and I don't totally know why, but we do know that the majority of people who are in tents downtown tend to be disproportionately white male, although not exclusively. And so that does create a little bit of an equity question, but also it is a legal requirement under Oregon law. So I'm curious into what degree, since we do not have that same policy, we don't have to be able to specifically offer. But I do question, based on our own data of number of houseless people, number of shelter beds, if we even really can say that we can offer shelter at the point of a sweep.
That last question, I don't have a great answer to, but I wanted to respond to a few things, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
I will say we are looking at the demographic data of who is accessing our shelter sites, and one of the reasons we are interested in open referral is we are noticing some disproportionality for the sites that are primarily serving camp removals. That is not in the direction we would want to go in terms of reducing disparities for folks experiencing homelessness. And then I did want to say, we do have some, to your point around sort of exclusions, in particular folks who have behavior that's related to a disability. Two things. We do have 3 shelter sites that are specifically to serve folks who have behavioral health needs. It's not enough, but we have some. And then we are working, we have a lived experience advisory committee, which is a group of folks who have lived experiences of homelessness that helps advise our work. And then we have a meeting in a couple of weeks specifically to focus on experiences in shelter and exclusions related to behavior and how that impacts folks. So again, not enough, but those are things we're thinking about, and I think it's stuff that we should continue to talk about.
Great. And one of my questions is also, how, when we look at distribution, and I'm thoughtful about the difference, and I know this was not the data you collected, nor do I know if we collect this data at all. I think it is highly unlikely that the overwhelming majority of people who are unsheltered downtown were born and raised downtown. So do we know at all where people are coming from?
So we do collect that information in our point-in-time count surveys as a part of the street count. As Doc said, we will have new information relatively soon from the most recent street count. And I am going to take a risk by quoting data that I don't have directly in front of me, but we do talk about this a lot. So in our last point-in-time count, we don't ask by neighborhood, of course, but we do ask sort of where were you then, like where last time you became homeless, where did you live? And only 17% of folks, and this is the number that I will confirm and email to all of you, were from out of the metro area.
Additionally, we are going to be conducting a survey with ATRAC at PSU in April, which will survey 400 people who are either currently or very recently experienced homeless, and that is one of the questions we ask, which is where was your first experience of homelessness, and then is this your first time experiencing homelessness in Multnomah County? So we'll have more information on that soon.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you again for this presentation. I think this, oh, so sorry, go ahead.
But thank you.
I know.
Just about everything was covered. So, we have an amazing board, don't we? Just thank you. I mean, thank you, Commissioner Singleton, for flagging East County. And as I got briefed yesterday, our staff got briefed yesterday. So thank you, Doc, and Director Plum for just the work and the presentation. Just want to quadruple down on just being intentional. I know we have our East County meetings around houselessness, just intentionally reaching out to our team out there. We have our outreach team. It's not perfect, but clearly the results are fairly decent as far as the population that we're our neighbors that we're serving out east. I do have just two questions to build off of what's been asked already. One question has to do with just the mayor's plan, Mayor Wilson's plan. What's the difference between what he's presenting and what we're doing as far as the strategy? Could you speak to that? And then I know we'll talk about that some more next week when he comes to present.
Yeah, and I think I will let him speak to it as well, but I will say one of the major differences are the open hours. So our shelters are, for the most part, outside of Seaway, they're open 24 hours a day, whereas his right now are designed to be overnight. And that allows us to have shelters to have services on site during those waking hours. It's not consistent across our shelters, the level and design of the services, but we do, that 24/7 allows folks, A, to have a safe place to be during the day. They can keep their stuff. They don't have to move around. And it makes it easier to, for folks to stabilize and access services. That's one of the major things that major differences I would call out.
Yeah.
Great. And then yesterday I flagged just, we all volunteered at the DRC, the warming shelters last week, really interested in how we can, as far as the referral process and the services are being offered during that time. And I know we'll talk more about that. And then my final question just has to do with just the shelter availability. I know some of the service providers have mentioned just knowing what beds are available and community members as well. Where are we at on that?
Thank you so much for asking that, because I forgot to say it in the presentation. We have been working through a pilot of a shelter availability tool. That is a mobile app. Right now, we're moving from pilot into full implementation. The pilot was specifically for those 100 beds in the shelter set aside program, because again, we have a strong relationship with those providers and it's a little bit of a controllable system to pilot. What that tool does is the folks who have access to the app, ideally they have their location turned on for this app, and they can say, so for example, if I was looking for a shelter unit, I would say I'm an adult female and I am looking for a shelter for me and my family, and I have like this particular need. The app would default to showing me the shelters first that were closest to where my phone says that I was, and it would let me know what was available. I'm using a bad example because I'm asking for a family and those aren't on the pilot, but if I were a single adult, I would say I'm a single adult. I would not be able to book via that site, but it would show me what is open and then how to call and try to access one of those open beds. We are moving right now, and it will be in April, to having all of the current open referral shelter units having their data in that tool. And we're expanding to outreach workers who are funded by the Joint Office or who refer into those open referral shelter beds. So that process is ongoing and will be finished up in April.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And that's great news about that system, and also knowing that there's training and making sure that the folks that are having access to this, like our outreach workers, are able to understand the new system so that we can be using it and seeing those results. So I'm very excited about that coming. So thank you so much for this presentation. As you can see, this is a topic of great interest, and I think because this is such an important piece as we're thinking about the entire continuum of homeless services, whether it's from prevention to shelter to housing to the wraparound services that folks need, this is a key piece in that work. And I do look forward to the conversation that we're going to be having with Mayor Wilson next week when he is presenting the plan, and I think that will be another opportunity for this board to ask questions and to get an understanding of that. And I'll just remind everyone that we are also having a joint city and county meeting next Wednesday, where we are going to be talking about some of the specifics within the Homeless Response Action Plan and the homeless response system as a part of our IGA. So thank you all for this. This is a great presentation. All right. So now we are going to be moving on to our next informational briefing, which is on internal services rates. And as we have the folks from DCA come down, I just want to say how much I appreciate the work of the Department of County Assets. The work that they do every day is really the backbone of the work that this entire organization is able to do to support our workforce, to grow, evolve, and create a future in which our organization is stronger and has the resources it needs. So today's briefing is a part of that work, and I deeply appreciate it. In preparing for the budget season, we're committed to bringing forward topics early for this board to process and ask questions, so there's a better understanding of some of the some of the foundation upon which county services are built and county budgets are built, like the internal services rates, which is the thing that we're focusing on for today's presentation. So there's a lot of thought that goes into how DCA works through managing our approach to technologies and facilities and fleet. There are a lot of conversations happen with DCA and other departments to bring those services forward efficiently. So I think that we'll hear a lot about some of the work that goes around that, some of the challenges that are being faced, and really just appreciate this chance to have a conversation about this critical component to the work that the county does. So I will happy turn it over to Tracy Massey, our DCA director.
Oh, and Chair, just really quickly, I need to read the title into that.
You totally do. Go ahead.
So sorry. R3, informational briefing on internal service rates.
Yes, thank you. I think when we do briefings, I'm more used to just rolling on Tuesdays. So thank you so much for that, Marina. All right, Tracy, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. My name is Tracy Massey, and I use she and her pronouns. I'm the Department Director for County Assets. And I have members of my senior leadership team with me here who will be sharing presenting duties. I am getting over a cold, so my voice sounds a little funny. I have Sim Ogle, Karenza Mock, and Dan Zalko here. I also have Lisa Whedon as backup if we need questions, but I want to take a moment to acknowledge Lisa and her 10 years of service to the county. She retired late last year and is supporting us through the 2026 budget cycle and training our new budget and finance manager, Nancy Artman, who's also here. And Lisa, in her role as DCA's budget manager since 2014, has dramatically improved and advanced our budget processes, including the internal service rate development that we will be covering today. Our process features significantly more collaboration, transparency, and accuracy than ever before. And thank you, Lisa. All right, next slide. Okay, so here's our agenda for today. We have about 40 minutes of prepared script, and we'll be eager to answer any questions. We are talking about internal service rates and DCA's budget for the current fiscal year. However, we aren't diving into the details of the budget or performing any math live here in this room. The big picture outcomes for today are to distinguish DCA's internal services from the Department of County Management, understand how DCA develops its budget, and then understanding how that budget is transformed into internal service rates, which are shared across the county. This will include both operational methodologies and our facilities capital improvement program. Next slide, please. All right, so who is DCA? We've got part of our deck missing, but okay. We'll see what comes up. You will see photos of DCA staff in action.
I'll pull up a better version, I'm so sorry.
Thank you, Marina. One more. There we go. All right. So throughout our slide deck, you'll see DCA staff in action, and this is Terry from our Records and Archives program. All right, next slide, please. I want to orient you to DCA by highlighting our mission, vision, and values, which were originally developed in 2011 through a collaborative process and then refreshed in 2022 under my leadership. Our mission, vision, and values fully align with and support the county's newly created mission, vision, and values. DCA ensures that those who serve the community have what they need to provide exceptional services. This is in alignment with being an internal service provider and an enabler to the rest of the county. Stewardship is a key value that guides our role to plan and care for the county's assets. Next slide, please. All right, so what services does DCA provide as an internal service provider? When you think of DCA, we want you to think of these strategic and enabling services and associated assets. So information technology, facilities, real estate and property management, fleet services, including our motor pool, distribution services, records and archives management, and business services, which is finance and purchasing and contracting, which supports our ability for DCA to deliver across the county. And we also offer finance and purchasing and contracting support for non-departmental groups like yourselves. Additionally, you will see that while DCA is not responsible for workplace security, we support the county, the Department of County Management by managing the billing and revenue collection for contracted security due to our unique position as the only department with an internal service funding structure and billing capability. For clarity, centralized services such as central HR, budget, auditor's office, and central finance, including the risk fund, are not considered part of DCA's internal services. These are indirect costs that cover overhead expenses and risk reserves, and they are financed through countywide indirect rates charged to all county departments. DCM's indirect rates will be discussed at a later time. Next slide, please. All right, this is an orienting slide. This slide shows our high-level organizational structure, which is aligned with each of our internal service functions. For fiscal year 2025, DCA's total budget was around $221 million. This excludes the majority of the large capital projects like the library capital bond, even though we are responsible for that. And we have 406.5 full-time equivalents. Next slide, please. All right, the budget overview here is what I'm going to move into, and this is distribution staff member Teddy. Next slide, please. All right, this slide is meant for context. It's an overview of our budget. Here we have each internal service function listed on the left, and my left, I should say, and with the total adopted budget. And we've split that budget into what we refer to as operational budget and non-operational. Next slide. So this slide is meant to describe what we mean by non-operational budget of $117 million. Dan, Sim, and Corenzo will be providing more detail, but at the 30,000-foot level, our operational budget strives to make sure that when you show up for work, everything functions as it should. The internet, heating and cooling, vehicles, and all the base services. This is often called keeping the lights on in all the different senses for 6,000 employees across the county. Next slide. Okay, and what we're calling non-operational are our asset, can be categorized as asset management and pass-through. This slide highlights non-operational type costs, including replacement costs for IT devices, our facilities capital improvement plan, which Dan will be going through in detail, pass-through costs like utilities, contracted janitorial, and debt payments for buildings that we incur debt for, like McCoy, the courthouse, and DCJ's East County building. Next slide, please. Internal services, that's where I'm going to move to now, and this is Shireen, our IT support services manager with a college to county intern, Lily. Next slide. All right, this is an eye chart. I'm not going to go through this, but this is meant to be, we've provided some common internal service rate and financial definitions for your reference. As we move through the presentation. We will provide context as these terms come up throughout the deck. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are internal service rates and funds? Internal service rates are the prices that one department within a government charges another department for goods or services. These costs are designed to recover the full cost of providing the service, including direct costs such as salaries and materials, and indirect costs, overhead, like me, and depreciation of assets. DCA manages internal service funds that allow us to allocate costs of shared activities and leverage multiple funding sources. All of DCA's costs must be recovered in one way or the other. We build our budget, we allocate our budget to departments, and we recover costs based on actual expenditures multiplied by departmental internal service rate allocation percentages, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Some costs are covered directly as pass-through expenses. Next slide, please. So how are they calculated? This slide is kind of an oversimplification, but we're going to get to the details soon. DCA's overall budget is divided by each department's drivers, and that equals that department's internal service allocation. Our budget itself aligns with the needs of the county. It includes the costs for services that are both enterprise in nature, meaning they support the whole county, and are necessary to deliver services, as well as department-specific costs that are unique. Enterprise investments are more fixed in nature and can't easily be scaled down. For example, all departments benefit from the ability to access our network and use the internet. That's an enterprise type of cost. Our goal through this whole process is to build a methodical, fair budget based on a department's use of our services, costs, and drivers, and support our divisions provide. I will note that DCA's current rate model is aligned with industry best practices and standards. We've had, in particular, our IT rates reviewed a couple of different ways. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'll transition to discuss the allocation processes, and this is a photo of Arturo at the Profit Center where distribution is located. Next slide. All right, this slide presents a summary of the major phases of a DCA budget cycle. I'm going to start with phase one. From July to September, we begin in earnest to work on the next year's fiscal budget, keeping in mind that in June, we will have just completed a cycle. We validate a whole set of drivers with all departments. We hold different types of conversations and conduct analyses to inform our budget. We learn about planned and expected changes for the next fiscal year. Phase two starts in September and goes through October, and here we meet regularly with the chair and the central budget office for guidance and direction, learning about expected financial situation and priorities. Our managers build their cost-based budgets based on this knowledge, and the costs and drivers are modeled in our allocation models. In phase three, we're moving into developing the actual internal service rate allocations, and the full recovery model is built. We receive final guidance from the chair related to our rates, and we are communicating with departments, a lot of back and forth during this time, and there might be a lot of little adjustments along the way. In phase four, in December, we hold meetings with all departments to review internal service rates that are based on our budgets. Quite frankly, it's never enough time, and we don't always make everyone happy, but we strive to be transparent and collaborative. In December, our internal service rates are published, and the rest of the county begins their budgeting process. DCA also joins in at this time. We begin to focus on program offers, capital plan, and this year we're working on additional reductions given the challenging financial outlook ahead. Historically, our Community Budget Advisory Committee begins in December, and they are focused on our one-time only requests in the county capital plan. This has been their desire, and it may change with the revised CBAC process. Phase five then is ongoing with recovery of costs based on actual expenses, asset replacement, and capital collection. And as you can see from this slide, DCA is in perpetual budget development, and it feels like an infinity circle. Looking over at Christian, the same. Next slide. Okay. Now we're going to start looking at some numbers. These numbers are related to the ones I showed earlier. The table on the left showed DCA's budget of $211 million. The table on the right shows the same amount, $211 million, but split out another way. You can see the internal service recovery amount of $179 million, and we will be focusing on that for the majority of the rest of this presentation. The yellow highlighted amount, those are our costs that we will recover from departments. The non-highlighted items have different funding mechanisms. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide shows the 2025 adopted internal service allocations, which can be found on the county's budget website. On the left, we have all of the internal service functions and then the departments across the top. If you go to the bottom right-hand corner, you see a total of $179 million, which aligns with previous slides and includes the security pass-through. If you go up to the subtotal line, you'll see the $172 million, and that's just DCA without the contracted security. So this is what departments use to begin to build their budgets. I also want to note that DCA only allocates the department level, so individual county departments may further reallocate their dollars among their internal divisions and programs using a number of different mechanisms and department-specific drivers. Now I will turn it over to Sim.
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, Commissioners and Chair Vega-Peterson. My name is Sim Ogle. I'm the Deputy Chief Information Officer, and my pronouns are he, him. The picture, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The picture on this slide shows Isa, who's a member of IT's Infrastructure Services team. Next slide, please. For some of you, this may be a repeat. For others, this is new, so I'll briefly walk you through the information. This slide covers IT's FY 2025 budget. On the top right, you can see that that was $97.2 million, and we have 189 FTEs working in the department. It also shows our structure. IT is centralized. We support the entire county. The slight caveat to that is the Sheriff's Office and the DA use the infrastructure that we provide, but have own staff to manage their systems. IT is functionally organized. That's represented by all the boxes with the colors at the bottom of the screen. Infrastructure services provides core services like network, servers, storage, and laptops. Information security protects county systems and data. The Project Management Office manages technology projects and tracks IT performance. Applications and Data Services creates and maintains tools, websites, and the data that you use. Enterprise Architecture ensures technological alignment, sets standards, and maximizes our investments. And finally, our portfolio teams manage relationships with the departments and elected officials like yourselves and understand the department's needs and plans. IT's primary focus is maintaining and securing operations, a complex task involving thousands of assets and dedicated staff support. These IT teams are grouped into service areas for the purpose of our ISR calculations, which we'll explore next. Next slide, please. IT groups teams into service areas, and these areas use similar ISR calculation drivers. A driver is a measurable approved assumption of internal factors. For example, the ERP team shown in the top left, that service area uses headcount as a driver. Larger departments pay more for ERP tools like Workday, which everybody uses. Infrastructure and asset replacement use counts of things used, for example, servers, storage, laptops, etc. That's the drivers for those teams. Other service areas are more complex, capturing work for departments via recorded hours, software licenses, professional services, and enterprise costs. As Tracy mentioned, enterprise costs are essential maintenance benefiting everybody, and they scale with department size and asset use. An example might be servers that underpin all of the systems that we have or databases that power those systems. Next slide, please. There's a lot on this slide, so I'll walk you through from the left to right. So our ISR development starts with IT staff understanding your strategic goals, application life cycles, and prioritize projects through conversations. That's the first box. Every summer, then, our IT managers validate our assumptions and ISR calculation drivers with each department, connecting your plans with the teams doing the work. The IT driver selection section reflects the verified information we capture. That includes staff support time, project management time, software licenses, headcount, physical assets. In other words, everything departments need technologically to support their work in the community. IT also collects funds for hardware, server, software, network, telecom, and AV equipment replacement. We calculate the total replacement cost, divide that by the asset's lifespan, which may be between 3 or 5 years, and collect 1/12 of that monthly. Departments influence ISRs most effectively by reviewing and consolidating software and aligning those with organizational standards. Large-scale changes like reducing laptops have minimal immediate impact but affect long-term replacement costs. All of these drivers feed into our rate model, which calculates departmental allocations during the county's rate-setting process. Finally, this work results in 2 monthly charges billed 30 days in arrears based on actuals. We fully expect to spend our budget, but at the end of the year, if there is underspend, the departments will see this reduction. These adopted ISR allocations are then published on our website. Next slide, please.
I just want to do a time check because I want to make sure we have time for questions.
Okay.
We are gonna probably go over noon for about a little bit, just to make sure folks that are aware of that. You got the coffee, good to see that. Me too, I got a refill.
Thank you, Chair. This slide shows IT's adopted ISR allocations by department, with both of those items highlighted in yellow. IT allocation primarily scales with department size. Larger departments require more IT support, thus receiving a larger ISR share. I will now transition to my colleague, Dan Zalko.
Thank you, Sim. Good morning, Chair Vega Peterson and Commissioners. My name is Dan Zalko, the Division Director for Facilities and Property Management. It's really nice to be with you today. The individuals you see here are Alyssa and Morgan from our dispatch and compliance team, respectively, working on our annual disaster preparedness exercise. Next slide, please. So for FY25, FPM's total budget is about $86 million, and this does not include the library capital bond and other medium and large projects not funded through our annual capital improvement funds. We have 139 employees who maintained about 90 owned buildings and structures and manage about 80 leases. The division is organized around major functional areas. We have our planning, design, and real estate and construction work, excluding the library capital bond projects overseen by Greg Hockert. Our client and support services, such as property management, our dispatch center and building safety and compliance team, overseen by Jeff Lewis. Our operations and maintenance teams, which include HVAC engineers, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, locksmiths, and others, overseen by Michael Smith. And lastly, our library capital bond team, overseen by Kate Vance. Next slide, please. Now, here are our major funding buckets in FY25. Our presentation today is how DCA's internal service rates are structured this year, as opposed to next year when the structure will be a little different. This year, in our operations and maintenance bucket, we have maintenance, property management, janitorial services, and most of our support functions. Our capital bucket includes our capital improvement funds, a focus later in our presentation. And another bucket are our direct pass-throughs that building occupants pay directly, such as leases, utilities, and enhanced service districts. The service districts include downtown's Clean and Safe District and the Central East Side District. Also in this category is contracted security, overseen by the workplace security team under the Department of County Management, but which pass through FPM financially. And lastly, we have debt service associated with some past large construction projects, such as the Central Courthouse, Gladys McCoy Building, and Community Justice's East Campus buildings. Next slide, please. We develop our budget in the fall. On the left shows that we assess building conditions and any changing needs and confirm space information and any unique issues with departments. We then use square footage and building type information, such as health clinics, detention facilities, offices, and warehouses, to determine how FPM's operations and maintenance budget is allocated to departments. We also use square footage information to determine the allocation of capital improvement funds, which you see along the bottom of the slide. In the middle of the far right column under allocation groups, you see our major pass-through budgets, which are allocated to each associated building or lease. Next slide, please. Now back to our summary slide, highlighted here in yellow, our FPM's budget. The $76 million labeled FPM and 8.4 labeled FPM enhanced, which includes janitorial services and those enhanced service district costs that I noted earlier. Next slide, please, and I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Carenza.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and good morning, soon to be afternoon, Chair and Commissioners. My name is Carenza Mock. My pronouns are she, her, and I am DCA's Deputy Director. Today, I will be discussing the internal service rates of our Fleet Motor Pool Distribution and Records and Archives Division. Pictured here is Alfredo from our Fleet Services team working on a DCS road maintenance truck. Next slide, please. On this graphic, you can see an overview of the fleet, motor pool, distribution services, and records and archives division. As each of those areas have their own unique considerations, they have their own internal service rate methodology. So I'll walk you through each of those. Next slide, please. So a little bit of an overview is fleet services, purchases, inspects, maintains, and repairs county vehicles and related equipment. We have approximately 800 vehicles and equipment in our fleet. Service needs for the following budget year are determined through conversations with each department and office. Specifically in the fall of each year, we ask our customers to validate our rate drivers, which for fleet is the number of vehicles and types of vehicles in their inventories. Based on those drivers, vehicles are categorized as either base or actual. Base vehicles get charged a flat rate each month, and the cost of repairs, maintenance, and fuel is included. Vehicles charged as actual are charged for actual costs only. This is typically heavy or specialized equipment where there is not enough of that type of vehicle in our fleet to come up with an informed base amount. We also allocate out our overhead costs, such as the cost of our facility internal service rate, the cost to pay our technicians and staff, et cetera. A side note that for damage due to accidents, the program will pay the deductible to fleet, and then the rest is requested from the risk management fund. We also collect for the replacement of vehicles into a separate fund, the asset replacement fund. We essentially calculate the total cost of replacing a vehicle divided by the number of years in the vehicle's life cycle and collect that amount each year. So when a vehicle is up for replacement, we use those funds. Next slide, please. Highlighted here are fleet services internal service allocations for each of the departments in fiscal year 25. DCM and JOHS don't have any fleet assets, which is why those read as zero. Next slide, please. Our motor pool program maintains and operates a shared pool of vehicles for county employee use and also provides rental car and car share options. Service needs for the following year are determined through conversations with each department and office. For rate drivers, we take the 3-year average of the program and then allocate out our calculated rates and overhead costs. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, the health department and DCHS are the largest users of our program, mostly due to their use of the car share and car rental program. Next slide, please. Distribution Services provides the pickup and delivery of interoffice mail, which includes vaccines and pharmacy transfers, as well as interoffice special deliveries, which includes bulk mailings, large records moves, and school dental equipment moves. The program also provides for the pickup and processing of U.S. mail. Service needs for the following year are determined through conversations with each department and office. The driver for the rate is the number of mail stops, and charges are then allocated on those fixed stops, as well as special deliveries and any pass-through costs, such as mass mailings for DCM or elections. Next slide, please. And here are the allocations by department for distribution services in fiscal year 25. I feel like I'm racing here, but next slide, please.
You do have the most to cover, so.
I know, right? We call it the smalls, my group. Our records and archives department have two related yet separate arms. So records helps ensure that county records are accessible, organized, and legally compliant. They maintain a collection of physical and electronic records and retain and destroy records in accordance with public records law. Approximately 10% of our records are archival. So archives stores and preserves county archives for items that have enduring historical value. Items include artifacts, board documents, drawings, posters, plans, maps, photographs, and videos. Service needs for the following year are determined through ongoing conversations with each department and office. So records center costs are covered by 3 drivers. 1, the records actions, which are requests for us to pull the files and the records. 2, the items accessioned, which are new boxes sent to the record center. And 3 is boxes stored, and those are the pass-through costs of having a record center, essentially. Electronic records actions are digital files entered into our electronic records management system, Content Manager, and we allocate based on newly created records in the system. And the number of shred bins as a pass-through cost. We administer those services for the county. Next slide, please. And here you can see the internal service rate allocations by department for fiscal year 25 for records and archives. And I will now hand it over to Tracy, who will provide a department-specific example of our internal service rates.
Thank you, Carenza. Before we go to the next slide, we're going to look at the health department. So on this slide, the health department's kind of in the center, and you can see their total allocation is $42 million, and that's what we'll look at on the next slide. So this slide has a lot of information on it, but it tells the story of how we got to that total of $42 million. So from a big picture, the box on the left shows DCA's total internal service rate amount of $172 million, excluding security contracted. And then during the budget cycle, we go through the process that we described. And in each area, you can see the counts of equipment, space, hours, all those kinds of things, and the allocated amount for each internal service area, which totals up to the $42 million for the health department. I'm going to turn it over to Dan now.
Thanks, Tracy. For our last section, next slide, please. The capital improvement plan. I will be going through this a little faster than planned, out of respect for your time, but if anyone wants to get together with Tracy or I to dig into the details of this body of work, just please let us know.
Yeah, I will say this is a really important piece for the county as a whole, both what we're considering now, what we're considering in out years in terms of our capital project priorities. So yeah, we can definitely bring, if we don't have enough time to discuss today, we can definitely bring this back for further conversation.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So we develop our CIP annually, and you all approve, it's a 5-year plan, and you all approve year 1 of that plan each spring. The current plan includes nearly 300 projects across 53 buildings. A large majority, about 85% of the funds are allocated to specific projects, and the remaining is used for scoping, facility condition assessments, accessibility improvements, emergency issues. Anything unplanned over $250,000 requires your approval per the administrative procedure FIN 15. Next slide, please. As you would imagine, most of the funds are used for the major building systems like roofing, heating, ventilation, and cooling, fire, electrical, and plumbing systems. Also used for smaller systems like cameras, access control, detention electronics, irrigation systems, and parking lot repayments. Departments and offices that occupy space and own buildings contribute funds to the program. This fiscal year, that's about $8 per square foot, and totaling about $22 million. Next slide, please. There are 3 funds. One is specific to the library district. Another is the Asset Preservation Fund from programs that occupy space in newer buildings or ones that have undergone major renovations, and then the Capital Improvement Fund for programs that occupy space in our older buildings. And the reason for having those 2 funds for non-library buildings is to ensure that our newer buildings continue to receive investment to extend their life and ensure they remain safe and comfortable. Next slide, please. Now, this is just a simple view of some of the key information of our CIP, which is a very large spreadsheet, a few dozen columns, all the projects I noted. But highlighted here, as you can see, a few things. One is that many of our projects are 2 or more years. Number 2, we do have inflation taken in, that's included in the spreadsheet. So you will see projects where the current estimated dollars different than what's shown in a future year. And then lastly, I'll note that the far right column, the unfunded column, you'll see Gresham Probation has a project where the funds are in that column. A lot of projects don't fit in our 5-year plan because we have many more identified needs than there is funding. Next slide, please. Now, here's our schedule over many months that we start in the late summer, developing ideas from our subject matter experts, primarily within the facilities division across our trades. We also take information from our facility condition assessments that we did over buildings. We seek input from county programs and then organize everything in addition to reforecasting any active multi-year projects as well. We meet with the chair in December during our internal rate process to determine rates for the next year, and then the plan concludes with some final forecasts in early spring and any last-minute adjustments from Tracy or me. Next slide, please. I had mentioned the facility condition assessments. We've been doing a lot over the last couple years where we have 2 vendors on contract that do detailed analysis of building systems and equipment to identify any future needs. Excuse me. These help us populate our CIP to go beyond just our internal expertise. The FCAs also include a facility condition index for each building. On the right, you see 9 buildings. This allows us to compare buildings relative to each other and understand where the greatest needs are. Next slide, please. We do have criteria to help us score proposed projects to help us populate that 5-year CIP with such things as life safety, operational savings, and impact on the workplace environment. Next slide, please. So the team of folks who manage the capital improvement funds consists of a manager, 10 project managers, and a project coordinator. They have about 155 active projects among them, with 56 that have either started this year or plan to start later this fiscal year. We have 163 tentatively scheduled to start over the next 40 years. In our last plan, there were 40 projects totaling $37 million that did not fit in the plan, as I noted earlier. Next slide, please. Now, these next 2 slides show different ways we view our capital improvement plan. This is the Asset Preservation Fund, non-library buildings that are either newer or have undergone major renovations. We look at it in a couple ways to ensure that we're distributing the funds equitably across the county to ensure that all programs see the benefits of the funds they contribute to those funds. So this first slide shows the distribution by number of projects. And as you would imagine, the larger buildings often see the largest number of projects, like the Multnomah Building and Inverness Jail. Next slide. And then another way of looking at it rather than by project is by dollars. The distribution in this case is not much different, but we do look at those differences to ensure we're spreading the funds out well across the county. All right, next slide, please. All right, I'll turn it back over to Tracy. Tracy.
All right, thank you. That concludes our formal prepared remarks, so we are ready for questions.
Thank you so much. And I will say, especially because we have so many new board members, internal service rates and the ways that they work and how they're brought up. This is like, it takes a while to just understand it. And so if you have additional questions, that's perfectly fine. And there will be further opportunities to have conversations about this and understand the impact, especially when we get into the budget period. But what I wanted to do is make sure you just had this information to look at and to work through and had the opportunity to follow up with DCA on questions well ahead of conversations we may be having around the budget. So with that, I will turn it over to Commissioner Singleton to see if you had any questions at this time.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation and all the work that goes into the materials that you put together. Super thorough, so I appreciate that. Quick question is, where do real estate brokers fit in the FPM budget?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Singleton, for that question. We do work with a couple brokerage firms, CBRE for the joint office work, and a collaboration between Apex and Cushman & Wakefield for everything else. Our leasing, we have an internal leasing specialist who handles the smaller scale stuff, such as renewals, and she's part of our internal, that position is part of our internal service rates. But the brokerage companies work on fee-based work, and that gets incorporated into the transactions for either the leases or the acquisitions and are not part of our internal service rates.
Thank you. And then therefore come from the specific budget of the department that is purchasing that building or leasing that building?
Yes, that's
correct. Okay, thank you. I think just something for the future that I'll be interested in is the kind of contracting component. And this is not just a question I will have for you all as we move through the budget. I'm really looking at what are we contracting services for, and are those contractors paying living wages for the folks so they can actually live in the community that they work. And I don't expect that answer now, but just know that I'll ask that during the budget. And then lastly, I just want to appreciate, Director, you've spent a lot of time with me, particularly on the capital improvement plan and sending some materials to dig more into. So I look forward to those ongoing discussions, but just appreciate your responsiveness to my questions and trying to wrap my head around all of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Moyer.
Yeah, I am curious about the process that you use to determine on the current capital projects, the ones that are in our 5-year plan versus did not make our 5-year plan. And just at a later date, I'd love to see those 40 projects that didn't. So if you could give me just a little bit of background of the process we use to figure out if we're going to put something on the 5-year plan, or we know we should, but it falls into that 40.
Yeah, sure, Commissioner Moyer. Yeah, we'd be happy to share the full plan with you and talk through it. I look at that unfunded column as column 6, if we had a year 6. We score all the projects, and then a team of subject matter experts in facilities score them. They also look for ways to combine projects, make things more efficient within same buildings or same types. And then whatever, then they place the projects based on that scoring and other priorities. And some just end up in the 6th column and become ones that don't fit because they are of either lower scores or lower priority, usually based on that.
And I just have a question. I don't know if it falls under you guys or you work with another department, but in reviewing last year's budget, my staff looked at our bonding capacity and our unused bonding capacity. How do you guys, or is it another department, make recommendations related to should we tap in to that for a project versus it could be we did the library levy, so that's separate, but I'm really curious about how we manage our bonding capacity and when we do or don't tap into it and what considerations.
So I'm going to jump in because that is a really good question, and I've been having a very Tuesday, I think we had an hour-long meeting. So what we were presented today was the CIP, the capital improvement plans, right? So those are projects in existing buildings. But as we're looking at doing either major renovations or purchasing new buildings, that is a separate capital plan that, okay, so that is not what we're talking about today. I know it's, but that is a separate plan. And those decisions on should we go out for a different revenue source to help pay for these things, or should we look at increasing our debt capacity to take on some of this work? Those are decisions that are going to be made by this board for those things, including which projects we want to be moving forward with and which we don't. And so you will see some of those, but there is internal work that is done to help prioritize with, across the organization to, thinking similar to this, in that it's what are some of the most urgent needs, what are the departments thinking, all of that. But ultimately, this board has the opportunity to make decisions like that through our budgeting process. So what we're going to see in some of the proposals that'll be public very soon for the departments are a prioritized list based on those department conversations to help inform us and to help give us some perspective, but ultimately it's up to this board. Okay. And Tracy, anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, that was great. I think one piece of clarity that helped me when I was trying to understand all these different things is what we include as part of our rates is capital improvement projects, not generally not capital projects. So so that's the key, to just try to separate those two.
Yes, and I will say, and Eric's here, and Eric is a very trusted advisor for this board in helping us to determine what is the right financial things, or help advise us on making some of those financial decisions about that too.
But clarifying question, so we don't use bonding or other debt services to fund capital improvements. Is that correct?
Generally not. There could be a case, our standard is no. There could be a case with a very large one where it could be considered, but yeah, typically not.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Jones-Dixon.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I don't have any additional questions. I'm extremely interested in the point that Commissioner Singleton brought up as far as the contracting resources. And again, just want to say thank you, because our constituent liaison came from your department, the Kemi. So shout out to you all for that as well. And then congratulations on your retirement too. Thank you for moving us through the process.
Thank you. I do have to say, when I saw Kemi in here, when I came in, I just smiled so big. I was so happy to see her.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Brown Edwards.
Good morning, or I think maybe it's afternoon now. Thanks for the presentation. I want to just personally thank you for keeping the lights on. I know when I first got here and the lights turned off automatically at 6 o'clock, I was like, wait, it happened, and it got fixed. So now if I'm here after 6, which I frequently am, the lights don't automatically turn off. But I know keeping the lights on is way more than the lights overhead, but everything else. So I know that's sort of the backbone of keeping our county operating and providing services. Two things. I'm going to take you up on the briefing on the capital projects, the facilities plan. This is something I'm glad to hear Commissioner Moyer raising it again, that I'm interested in, and how we're, especially with some key assets, how we fund and prioritize and move them along. Both the Multnomah County Detention Center, which by all accounts needs, we need a new one. And then also the animal shelter, which I know that's an ongoing project, but just how do we sort of get after these larger projects? I'm going to reserve, I'm going to ask the same question I think I asked last year, because I'm going to keep asking it, because it builds into when you get your budget and they're like, and there's this line that you really don't have any discretion about. And it's all the things that you explained. I'm curious about the ongoing work that's happening around facility utilization. And on slide 14, it says that the current rate model is aligned with industry best practices and standards. And I'm going to ask the question again, because as I'm out and about in county buildings, the county, unlike the city, which is in a partial return to work, at least the managers and supervisors, when you go out into county buildings, depending on what they are, sometimes there's whole floors that seem like there's nobody working in them, and other places where, given the sort of direct consumer interfacing, it appears to be sort of fully staffed, utilized building. And I'm curious about the ongoing work that's happening, because if the rest of the county is paying for space that actually isn't being utilized because of a permanent change, how is that being adjusted for? Or is it, we still think there's a flex back, but when you have sort of like a manager's office that's sitting there not being used because they're actually hybrid and they're using it maybe once a week or twice a week, how are we adjusting for that and utilizing our space better? Because the more effectively we use our facility spaces and the resources we have for that, obviously the more money we can put directly into county services. Sorry, that was a long question, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
Commissioner Brimhurst, thanks for the question. We're going to tag team this one. So in facilities, we collaborate with all departments on consolidation ideas. Over the last few years, the Health Department, County Human Services, JOHS, admin functions, community services, and I may have missed one, have all gotten out of leases over the last few years and consolidated within other lease spaces or in owned spaces. And them, in addition to county assets and community management, have consolidated within owned spaces. Often, there are challenges because of the unique nature and variability across the programs. One program may have everyone come in on a Tuesday, and another program alternate desk space. There's also sometimes challenges based on the location of that space. For example, in this building, a quarter of the second floor is vacant, and we're always looking for how we might fill that, what lease we might be able to get out of. But it's not a logical space that we could lease out to someone else, and the office market is not in a place where leasing out office space is easy. There's also long-term plans in place. For example, Gladys McCoy, an owned building with some underutilized space. We don't have any short-term plans, but we have a large lease downtown that we are working with the Health Department and County Human Services on when that lease ends, doing more consolidation within McCoy. So we've made some short-term changes, but with physical space, sometimes the changes can take a while. And then I'll let Tracy talk about a more centralized effort going on to look at utilization.
Right, so the other piece about this is that we, in facilities, are partnering with DCM and Human Resources and the research unit to look at data around telework agreements, telework status, and assigned space, and sort of marrying that data together and looking to see if there are opportunities sorry, it's disorienting to see myself, opportunities that the data points to where there might be other ways to look at consolidation or better leveraging our space. So that's an effort that is also underway.
And that's one of the things that I requested, to combine the HR data, the facilities data, the usage data, to really give us a whole picture of what's happening to allow us to make decisions about those kinds of things in terms of movement, all sorts of things. So I really appreciate Tracy and Travis and a lot of the folks around the county who are participating in that work.
So I'm curious, do you, as part of that work, are you doing active census? Having worked in a place where there's like facility utilization, because everybody's always looking at that number of because if you have less of that number, you can provide more services or commit it to higher priorities. And one of the things that's done is like a census, like if you have an individual office, but you only, the census data says that you only use it once a week, there's a conversation about is that actually needed? So I'm curious whether the county has, even in a targeted way, again, in county buildings, sometimes there are very few people in sort of private office spaces, or they look just empty, and maybe the day a week I'm there, but I'm just curious again about how we are optimizing our resources.
I'm not exactly sure I know what you mean by census. We are asking our property managers to provide a general sense of things that they see in the building, but specifically what the data is looking at is, for example, I have an assigned space and my telework agreement says this, and am I showing up? That's more of a conversation with managers and things. I don't know, so if that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, not quite. The census is just how often is the space used, is not whether are you coming to the office, but so for example, if you have a space, a floor plan that has a whole host of individual offices, and the work agreement is that you're hybrid and only 2 days a week you're using it, and you have essentially 3 days a week private offices not being utilized. decision could be, maybe there's going to be hoteling or a sharing of that space versus.
Right, yeah.
So it's a sense, this is not like an employee accountability piece.
Yeah.
It's more like, is
That
this?
that is what this report, that is what this analysis is hoping to show, that kind of difference or discrepancy, so that it could be, that it could be used to inform future decisions. Yeah.
Great. And so just my last comment is we head into a budget process where reductions are potentially going to be made across the county. I'm going to be interested in this again because effective utilization of space and lowering that cost if it's not being used allows us to support other county services. So I'll be interested in whatever you, and this kind of goes to my question that I asked, this almost the same question last year, is like, where are we on that project? And how do we see, what do we see the trend line of our space utilization and when some of that might be coming to the county?
Yeah, and
it's more of a statement versus a question. So, but I'll be interested to see that, especially as we head into the budget process.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I want to make sure is clear is this was talking about FY25. We have, but the calendar that showed the budget process. So we have been having conversations with all of the data and information we have so far, starting in September, really to figure out what the internal service rates are going to be for FY26. And so, the most up-to-date data we will have, we're happy to share that. And like I said, this is something that I've asked to really get that full picture of facilities and use of spaces, depending on like where people are working and what the telework agreements are. We may, but because of how the budget process works, we may have limited ability to make adjustments in the FY26 budget because of just the timing of when some of these like things need to be locked in, so departments could build out their budget.
I appreciate that, and as noted, I think I asked almost the exact identical question last year when we got this presentation, so I guess I'll just keep asking. And somehow when I walk from my car into this building, I'm reminded daily about that second floor space. So it just triggers what's happening in all the rest of our buildings in terms of utilization. Thanks.
Well, it is great to see the second floor being built out for new. And I will say, there was a whole, right after COVID, there was a whole bunch of work that happened through a program called the Future of Work, where there was a lot of renovations and resetting of workspaces to bring in things like hoteling spaces, as it was recognizing that, employees have the ability to telework or do hybrid work, and that is something that, they have been very clear, is a preference. And so how does that affect that? So we've seen that some of those changes in this building with different spaces, and we've seen that across different county buildings as well. This is just, I think, a really important thing to continue to have a touch point on that and to really take that snapshot like now, 5 years later, of what things look like. So thank you so much for the briefing today. Like I said, this is a kind of setting just a foundation as we get into deeper conversations and with our budget and understanding the impacts of this work, since it isn't something that is super visible during that process, but is such an important component of the budget process. So I wanted to make sure this board had that clarity into how this worked. In March, I think March 6th, we are going to have a briefing on the county's capital plan. So to some of the questions on some of these like projects that are not in the improvement plan. And so I really am interested in hearing this board's priorities, like during that presentation or after we have that presentation. And I will say this is the earliest times we've had a public conversation on this topic since I've been at the county. But again, like I think there's a lot of considerations with this budget, and I want to make sure that you guys are getting the information that our departments have been working on. I also want to just say a huge thank you to Lisa for her years of service, the contributions that you've given to DCA, and through that to our entire county are really immeasurable. So thank you so much and I appreciate that you have stayed and continued through this budget process and bringing somebody along, because it is so critical, the work that happens in DCA. So thank you for that. So thank you all so much for this presentation. That concludes our regular agenda for today's meeting. So I wanted to see if there were any board comments for the board, and we can start with Commissioner Moyer. Okay, Commissioner Jones-Dixon.
Yeah, I just want to say again, thank you to all of the volunteers from last week. As far as the Public Works, I had the opportunity to work with the PIC, Francisco from the libraries, and then also Haley, she crushed it, and Jenka as well. So just want to say a huge thank you to just the staff here and the community for showing up and showing out for our neighbors that are most in need. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Brim Edwards.
Yeah, just going to echo Commissioner Jones-Dixon's comments on thank you to the community. As said, Doc, who presented earlier this morning, was the person who greeted me at Ascension, which is one of our winter sites. I think the other comment I want to make is as we move ahead, having a more in-depth discussion about the quarterly reporting and sort of what's coming out of it in terms of the Homeless Response Action Plan. Just had a chance to look through it, and there's places where we are meeting our goals, but other places where we're not, and having a discussion about what sort of mid-year adjustment. I'm also interested in hearing from the Joint Office around the planned closure of Do Good Multnoma's downtown site, and how the county's thinking about replacing those shelter beds. Again, I don't view Bybee Lakes, which is miles away, and for some people it might be just seem like a different planet. I mean, it's far from downtown, and how we're thinking about it being an and conversation. Both, it's great to be adding shelter beds at Bybee Lakes, but how are we also adding and replacing potentially the ones that we're losing downtown, which we know are needed. In addition, I'm also curious about what's happening with the Urban League project that we recently approved, that I heard that they then were not going to be pursuing. So I'd love to have a public discussion and I don't know whether it's a work session, but better understand sort of what we're doing in response to those things.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Singleton.
Thank you. I echo the appreciation on the severe weather response, and also look forward to the after action and some next steps, I think particularly in what we were hearing from participants in the difference in wanting to come and stay when they didn't have to leave at 7 a.m. I know there's trade-offs to that and there's costs, but it's an important conversation to have. I just wanted to share, we had the JPAC meeting this morning. It was almost completely filled with Multnomah County Transportation Project. It was a really robust discussion on Rose Quarter Improvement Project, as well as looking at bond scenarios that would include some funds for Burnside Bridge, as well as 82nd Ave, and then looking at 82nd Avenue's LPA. So there's more to come there. There wasn't a lot of decision-making this morning, but I think anybody who wants to dig in more, I'm happy to catch up. And of course, we'll brief you and catch you up as well. And I think some really good engagement. And I just wanted to highlight an appreciation I had for some of the presenters, particularly on Rose Quarter, who highlighted the need and desire to get these family wage jobs to people who are in our community. So continuing to look at not only DBE goals, but what are our local hiring preferences and other components for these major infrastructure projects to ensure that we can lift up people in our own community. And I think, lastly, I would say on some of the upcoming discussions around shelter, I think, I want to say this out loud. It's really important to me that we're looking at not necessarily a one-for-one replacement, but understanding the low barrier, the abstinence, the alternative, kind of that full spectrum, and what our bed counts are, what they cost, and the discussions of what the need is. So I know that's an ongoing discussion that we'll have in the coming weeks.
Thank you so much. I just want to add my thanks for everyone who showed up during the weather emergency. I know our COO sent out a message countywide, but I just appreciate everyone who has shown up for every county and city staff member and community volunteer who provided, who really pivoted to show up for our community. So even with nearly 3,000 year-round shelter beds, the 200 added during the winter shelter, we saw, especially on the last nights, over 900 more people a night came to our emergency shelters to find relief and warmth and food. And I think it's very clear just how critical and life-saving the county's severe weather response was last week. So we know that with those temperatures, there was a higher risk of hypothermia. And so it was great. And I want to thank all of you on this board for really sharing the messaging about both the shelters being available and the need for volunteers. So thank you. It was really great to see, and I know that made a difference. So I want to appreciate you. I also just wanted to note that yesterday was the Japanese Day of Remembrance, and so February 19th is the day to reflect on the consequences of the executive order that was signed during World War II to begin Japanese internment. It is also a day to reflect on the importance of building and maintaining positive, trusted connections between our community and local law enforcement partners to ensure that history isn't repeated. And yesterday I had the chance to give testimony on the reappointment of Portland Police Chief Bob Day, and it was really a great chance to speak on the importance of our shared work, and especially the work we're doing to help move people from potential contact with our justice system into our behavioral health and our services and our support network. And so I just wanted to mention both of those things. And then lastly, I just wanted to appreciate everyone who came to my budget town hall on Saturday morning. It was virtual. It was a very lively discussion, lots of questions from folks. This is in addition to the budget survey that we have going out, which has already had over 3,000 people participate in that, so that's fantastic. So that survey is continued to be open to March 3rd, so I just encourage people to fill that out. Thank you all so much. That concludes today's regular board meeting. There being no further business, the meeting is adjourned.